Katie Gallo stood stone-faced as the jury foreman read out the guilty verdict in the murder of her 8-year-old foster daughter, Sofia Martinez. What had begun as seemingly concerned messages expressing fear about the girl days before her death would become the digital breadcrumb trail that led investigators directly to a calculated murder. These text exchanges between Katie and her sister, filled with fabricated dangers and escalating paranoia, would ultimately expose not a dangerous child, but a dangerous caretaker who had been methodically building her defense long before taking Sofia's life. Sofia Martinez, an 8-year-old foster child, was found dead on January 7th in the home of her foster mother, Katie Gallo, in Fairbanks, Alaska. The child's body bore multiple bruises in various stages of healing, with the cause of death later determined to be strangulation. First responders described the scene as clinically clean, with Katie Gallo appearing remarkably composed as she led them to the child's bedroom, where Sofia lay arranged as if sleeping, though she had been dead for several hours. What began as a response to a seemingly distraught foster mother's emergency call would quickly unravel into one of the most disturbing cases of premeditated child murder in Alaska's recent history. The initial story Katie Gallo told to the emergency dispatcher was that Sofia had fallen down the stairs while playing, but the physical evidence immediately contradicted this account. Detective Ryan Palmer, the first investigator to arrive at the scene, noted the absence of any disturbance on or near the staircase, and the medical examiner would later confirm that Sofia's injuries were consistent with manual strangulation rather than a fall. Katie's demeanor struck the responding officers as oddly detached. She spoke about Sofia in clinical terms, repeatedly mentioning the child's behavioral problems and dangerous tendencies, while showing no emotional distress over her death. The incongruity between Katie's composed state and the brutality inflicted on her young charge raised immediate red flags for the investigators who secured the scene. The Gallo home, located in a quiet upper-middle-class neighborhood on the outskirts of Fairbanks, presented a facade of normalcy that belied the horror within. From the outside, the 2-story blue colonial, with its neatly shoveled walkways and Christmas decorations still hanging in early January, appeared to be the perfect family home. Inside, investigators found Sofia's room was sparse and impersonal, containing only a bed, dresser, and a small desk, with no toys, books, or personal items that would typically be found in a child's bedroom. By contrast, the rest of the home was meticulously decorated and maintained, with family photos prominently displayed showing Katie, her husband James, who was away on business at the time of the incident, and their 2 biological children who were staying with grandparents during the school break. The temperature in Sofia's room was notably colder than the rest of the house, with the vent closed and sealed with duct tape. Investigators discovered a baby monitor positioned to survey the room, and multiple locks on the outside of the door, modifications that Katie explained were necessary safety precautions due to Sofia's sleepwalking and destructive tendencies. A search of the home revealed a disturbing collection of documentation kept by Katie. A journal detailing Sofia's every perceived misbehavior, a video archive stored on her computer showing Sofia eating, sleeping, and playing, and a folder of printed articles about child psychopathy and reactive attachment disorder. Most crucially, investigators confiscated Katie's phone, which contained text message exchanges with her sister expressing growing fear and resentment towards Sofia in the days leading up to her death. The timeline of events became clearer as the investigation progressed through that first day. According to the medical examiner's preliminary report, Sofia had died between 9 and midnight the previous evening. Yet Katie had not called emergency services until 7:30 the following morning. Neighbors reported hearing nothing unusual the night before, though one recalled seeing Katie standing at her mailbox around 10 in the evening, which struck them as odd given the severe cold and late hour. School records showed that Sophia had been absent for 3 days prior to her death, with Katie citing a flu as the reason, though no medication or evidence of illness was found in the home. The stark contrast between the meticulously kept home and the evidence of prolonged abuse suggested a calculated attempt to maintain appearances while systematically isolating and harming a vulnerable child. As the sun set on that first day of investigation, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape of Fairbanks, the gravity of what had occurred in the Gallo home began to sink in for the investigating team. Detective Palmer secured a warrant to thoroughly examine Katie Gallo's digital communications, suspecting that the text messages glimpsed during the initial search might reveal the true nature of Katie's relationship with her foster daughter. The endless winter night of Fairbanks seemed to mirror the darkness they were uncovering, a calculated cruelty perpetrated against a child who had already endured the trauma of separation from her biological family. What none of the investigators could yet fully comprehend was how completely Katie Gallo's digital footprint would expose not just her actions, but her methodical construction of a narrative designed to justify the unthinkable. The community of Fairbanks, though accustomed to the isolation imposed by geography and climate, was shaken to its core by the news of Sophia's death. Local media initially reported it as a tragic accident, but as details began to leak from the investigation, a more sinister picture emerged that disturbed even the most seasoned residents. Parents hugged their children tighter that night. Teachers reviewed their mental notes about students in potentially vulnerable situations. And social workers began pulling files to review all current foster placements. The death of Sophia Martinez would soon force a reckoning within systems designed to protect the most vulnerable, revealing cracks that had allowed a predator to hide behind the respectable title of foster parent. Katie Gallo spent her first night after Sophia's death not in the home where the crime occurred, but in an interview room at the Fairbanks Police Department. Though not yet formally charged, the inconsistencies in her story and the mounting physical evidence made her the sole person of interest in what was now classified as a homicide investigation. During her initial interview, Katie maintained the composure that had struck first responders as inappropriate, speaking about Sophia as if discussing a problematic appliance rather than a child who had been in her care. Her recurring theme was fear of what Sophia might do to her biological children, fear of the child's unnatural calmness, fear that something was wrong with her. These statements, recorded meticulously by investigators, would later be compared against the digital evidence being extracted from her devices, revealing a calculated construction of fear designed to justify increasingly severe discipline. The forensic examination of Sophia's body told a story that contradicted every aspect of Katie Gallo's narrative. The child had not only been strangled with significant force, but had endured weeks, possibly months, of systematic physical abuse. Healing fractures in various stages were discovered in her arms and ribs, suggesting repeated episodes of violence. Malnutrition was evident, with the medical examiner noting that Sophia was significantly underweight for her age and height. Most disturbingly, small circular burns on the child's back and arms indicated deliberate infliction of pain using what was later identified as the heated end of a glue gun found in Katie's craft room. The medical evidence painted a picture not of a dangerous child who had suffered an accident, but of a vulnerable girl who had endured calculated torture before her life was finally, deliberately taken. As dawn broke on the second day of the investigation, the Fairbanks Police Department officially classified Sophia Martinez's death as a homicide. Katie Gallo was formally taken into custody, while forensic teams continued processing the house where Sophia had spent her final terrifying months. The search for evidence expanded to include Katie's vehicle, her workplace, and her digital presence across multiple platforms and devices. Detective Ryan Palmer, assigned as lead investigator, began the process of constructing a timeline of Sophia's life in the Gallo home, starting with her placement there 8 months earlier. What would emerge from this investigation was not just the story of a murder, but of a systematic campaign to isolate, dehumanize, and ultimately eliminate a child who had been placed in what should have been a safe haven. The contrast between the pristine winter landscape of Fairbanks and the ugliness of the crime created a surreal backdrop for the investigation that was now gaining momentum. Local residents left flowers and stuffed animals at the entrance to the Gallows neighborhood, a spontaneous memorial for a child few had known, but whose fate touched something primal in the community's collective conscience. News crews from Anchorage arrived, setting up outside the police station and requesting statements from officials who were still piecing together the full horror of what had transpired. Social media buzzed with theories, condemnations, and expressions of grief, while Sophia's school held an impromptu assembly to help students process the loss of their classmate. The ripples of Sophia's death spread outward through the frozen city, carrying with them questions about responsibility, vigilance, and the darkness that can hide behind closed doors. Sophia Martinez had traveled a difficult path long before she entered Katie Gallo's home in Fairbanks, Alaska. Born in Guatemala City to a young mother seeking a better life, Sophia spent her early years in a small apartment in San Diego, where neighbors remembered her as a cheerful toddler who would wave enthusiastically from their balcony. When Sophia was 6, her mother, Lucia Martinez, was detained during an immigration raid at the restaurant where she worked and subsequently deported, leaving Sophia temporarily in the custody of her mother's roommate before Child Protective Services intervened. The separation from her mother was the first profound trauma in Sophia's young life, one that social workers noted she processed with a remarkable resilience that would later be mischaracterized by Katie Gallo as unnaturally calm and emotionally detached. In the 2 years between her mother's deportation and her placement with the Gallos, Sophia had lived in 3 different foster homes, none of which were intended to be permanent placements. Teachers from this period described her as adaptable and eager to please, though they noted occasional withdrawal and anxiety that manifested primarily in her artwork, which often depicted lone figures in expansive, empty spaces. Despite these challenges, Sophia maintained above-average academic performance, showing particular aptitude in reading and mathematics, with her second-grade teacher noting that she had a mind like a sponge and could often be found helping classmates who struggled with concepts she had already mastered. Her final report card before moving to Fairbanks included comments about her infectious laugh and natural leadership qualities, characteristics that stood in stark contrast to the manipulative and dangerous child Katie would later describe in her texts and journal entries. Sophia's case file included psychological evaluations conducted shortly after her mother's deportation and again before her placement with the Gallos. Both assessments noted symptoms of adjustment disorder and attachment insecurity, common and appropriate responses to the significant disruptions in her young life. However, neither evaluation identified any behaviors consistent with the severe conduct disorders or psychopathic tendencies that Katie would later claim to observe. The second evaluation specifically noted Sophia's strong capacity for emotional regulation and age-appropriate empathy, directly contradicting the narrative Katie would construct. Sophia's court-appointed special advocate, who had followed her case in San Diego, described her as a child who wants very much to be loved and tries her hardest to earn that love, adding that she had never encountered a more grateful child in 15 years of advocacy work. The personal belongings that traveled with Sophia from San Diego to Fairbanks filled just one small suitcase, a fact that broke the heart of her special advocate, who had tried unsuccessfully to secure more of Sophia's possessions from previous placements. Among these precious few items was a worn stuffed rabbit that had been a gift from her mother, a photo album containing pictures of Lucia, and a collection of colorful river stones that Sophia had gathered during a school field trip to the beach. These items, which investigators would later find locked in a storage box in the Gallows garage, represented Sophia's attempts to maintain connections to her past and to her mother. The fact that these treasured objects had been confiscated and hidden from Sophia spoke volumes about Katie Gallo's systematic effort to sever the child's ties to her identity and previous attachments. Sophia's journey to Alaska had been positioned as a fresh start, a chance for permanent placement with a stable family in a new environment. The Gallos had completed the required foster parent training and home studies, presenting themselves as experienced parents motivated by genuine altruism. What the system failed to detect was Katie Gallo's history of controlling behavior and rigid expectations, traits that her biological children had learned to accommodate, but which would become lethal when directed at a vulnerable child already navigating the complex emotions of displacement and loss. Sophia's biological mother, communicating through limited phone calls monitored by immigration officials, had expressed concern about her daughter being sent so far north, worrying about the isolation and harsh climate. In a cruel twist, it was not Alaska's natural environment that would prove dangerous to Sophia, but the calculated cruelty of the woman entrusted with her care. In Fairbanks, Sophia had been enrolled in Jackson Elementary School, where she quickly adapted to her new classroom despite arriving mid-year. Her teacher, Mrs. Cardwell, would later provide investigators with samples of Sophia's work, including a self-portrait labeled "My New Home," showing a stick figure standing apart from a group of 4 figures, the sun shining above but not quite reaching the lone child. In her interview, Mrs. Cardwell recounted how Sophia had initially been eager to participate in class, raising her hand frequently and sharing stories about her previous schools in California. However, she noted a marked change in Sophia's demeanor approximately 2 months before her death, describing how the formerly engaged student became increasingly withdrawn, flinching at loud noises and declining to participate in physical activities where her now frequent bruises might be noticed. Sophia's classmates remembered her for her generosity and creativity during group projects and her skill at jumping rope during recess, a simple pleasure she embraced with contagious enthusiasm. One friend recalled how Sophia had created elaborate stories about a fantasy world where kids could go live with their moms whenever they wanted to, revealing the deep longing she carried for reunification with her mother. Another remembered Sophia sharing her lunch when a classmate had forgotten theirs, despite Katie Gallo's increasingly restricted food allowances that would later be documented in her controlling journal entries. These small acts of kindness and imagination painted a picture of a child who, despite her circumstances, maintained her capacity for empathy and joy, qualities that made her death all the more tragic, and Katie's characterizations all the more monstrous. The social worker assigned to Sophia's case in Fairbanks conducted monthly home visits, during which Katie Gallo orchestrated performances of domestic harmony. Investigation would later reveal how these visits were preceded by intensive rehearsals documented in Katie's texts to Sophia's court-appointed advocate, where Sophia was coached on appropriate responses and threatened with consequences for any deviation from the script. During these carefully managed interactions, Katie presented herself as a concerned, patient foster mother navigating the challenges of a traumatized child, while Sophia performed the role of a gradually adjusting foster daughter. The social worker noted the home's cleanliness and organization, the provision of basic necessities, and Sophia's quiet compliance during questioning, interpreting her reserved responses as progress rather than fear. The facade Katie constructed was so effective that even when Sophia's teacher raised concerns about unexplained injuries, the social worker accepted Katie's explanations of a clumsy face and attention-seeking behavior. In the weeks before her death, Sophia made several attempts to communicate her deteriorating situation, though none were recognized as the desperate pleas they were. She asked her school counselor if it was normal for moms to get really mad about accidents, and drew a picture for her art teacher depicting a small figure locked in a dark space while larger figures stood outside. Most significantly, Sophia approached the school nurse complaining of a stomach ache 3 days before her death, the last day she would attend school, and whispered, "My foster mom says I'm bad inside." The nurse, noting no fever or physical symptoms, sent Sophia back to class with a peppermint candy for her stomach, recording the visit as a possible case of anxiety, but not flagging it for further investigation. These missed signals would later haunt those who had interacted with Sophia, contributing to significant reforms in recognizing and responding to potential signs of abuse. The portrait of Sophia Martinez that emerged during the investigation was of a child whose natural resilience, intelligence, and warmth had been systematically attacked by her foster mother, but never fully extinguished. Interviews with everyone who had known Sophia outside the Gallo home, teachers, classmates, previous foster parents, medical providers, described a child who bore little resemblance to the dangerous, manipulative figure Katie had fabricated in her texts and journals. Former neighbors from San Diego shared videos of Sophia's 6th birthday party, showing a laughing child dancing with her mother in their small apartment, her face alight with joy as she blew out candles on a homemade cake. This footage, played during Katie's trial, provided a stark contrast to the final school photo of Sophia taken 3 weeks before her death, in which her smile appeared forced and her eyes held a wariness beyond her years. As investigators pieced together Sophia's life story, they also worked to locate and contact her mother, Lucia Martinez, who was living in a small village outside Guatemala City. The notification of her daughter's death had to be delivered through local officials, as Lucia had no phone and limited access to communication technology. Her response, transmitted back through diplomatic channels, was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "She was my sun and stars. I thought she would be safe there." Arrangements were made for Lucia to participate in the trial remotely, though the logistics were complicated by her location and immigration status. The knowledge that Sophia had died so far from her mother, while that mother fought tirelessly for legal re-entry to reclaim her daughter, added another layer of tragedy to a case already laden with systemic failures and personal betrayals. The final picture of Sophia Martinez that emerged was not just of a victim, but of a complete human being with strengths, hopes, fears, and dreams that had been cut brutally short. School records showed she had received a perfect attendance certificate the previous semester and had been selected to represent her class in the district-wide spelling bee, scheduled for the week after her death. The library book found in her backpack, still in the entryway where she had dropped it on her last day of school, was an advanced reader about women astronauts, with a bookmark placed halfway through. A partially completed friendship bracelet was discovered in her desk at school, presumably intended as a gift for a classmate. These unfinished threads of a life in progress underscored the magnitude of what had been lost when Sophia's life was taken, not just who she was, but all she might have become. The emergency call that initiated the investigation came at 7:32 on the morning of January 7th, with Katie Gallo's voice remarkably steady as she reported to the dispatcher, "My foster daughter had an accident on the stairs last night, and I can't wake her up this morning." The recording of this call, later played in court, revealed Katie's calculated attempt to establish her narrative from the very first moment of official contact. When the dispatcher asked if she had attempted CPR, Katie responded, "I don't think it would help. She feels cold," indicating she was aware Sophia had been dead for some time. The dispatcher directed Katie to attempt resuscitation anyway while paramedics were dispatched, but responding EMTs would later testify that upon arrival, they found Katie sitting in the living room rather than with the child, with no signs that CPR had been attempted, and Sophia's body showing obvious signs of rigor mortis. First responders arrived at the Gallo residence at 7:45, immediately recognizing that the child was beyond medical intervention and securing the scene as a potential crime site. Officer James Daniels, the first police officer to arrive, noted in his report that Katie Gallo appeared unusually composed and immediately began offering a detailed explanation about Sophia's alleged behavioral issues and the accident without being prompted. Paramedic Sarah Kwan observed that the child's body position appeared deliberately arranged rather than consistent with a fall, with Sophia lying on her back, with her arms carefully placed at her sides and a blanket pulled up to her chest. Most significantly, Kwan documented visible bruising around Sophia's neck that was inconsistent with injuries typically sustained in a fall, prompting her immediate notification to the responding officers that they were likely dealing with a homicide rather than an accident. Detective Ryan Palmer arrived at the scene at 8:23, by which time patrol officers had separated Katie Gallo from the crime scene and established a preliminary perimeter. Palmer's first actions upon entering the residence included a walkthrough with the department photographer to document the scene exactly as found, paying particular attention to the staircase where Katie claimed the fatal fall had occurred. His 22 years of investigative experience immediately raised red flags. The stairs showed no signs of disturbance, no scuff marks, or impact points that would corroborate Katie's account. And the distance from the stairs to Sophia's bedroom made it implausible that the child could have been moved there without assistance after a serious fall. The temperature of the home was another detail Palmer noted, with the thermostat set at 72 degrees throughout the house except for Sophia's room, where a separate thermometer revealed a temperature of just 58 degrees, contributing to the impression that the child's body had been cold for significantly longer than Katie's timeline suggested. The pivotal discovery occurred at 9:15, when Detective Palmer, conducting a preliminary search of the residence under exigent circumstances, noted Katie Gallo's cell phone on the kitchen counter and observed a text notification preview from someone identified as Jenna, sister, that read, "Did you call yet? Remember what we discussed?" When Palmer asked Katie about the message, her demeanor changed noticeably, and she attempted to retrieve the phone, claiming it contained private communications unrelated to Sophia. This reaction prompted Palmer to secure the device as potential evidence and request an immediate warrant for its contents, a decision that would ultimately crack the case open. The urgency of this request was based on Palmer's concern that remote wiping capabilities could result in the loss of crucial evidence, a precaution that proved prescient when digital forensics later discovered an unsuccessful remote wipe attempt initiated from a computer registered to Katie's sister approximately 30 minutes after the phone was confiscated. While the search of the Gallo residence continued, a parallel investigation began at Sophia's school, where Detective Olivia Mendez interviewed Sophia's teacher, school counselor, and the nurse who had seen Sophia 3 days prior to her death. These interviews yielded critical information about the behavioral changes observed in Sophia over the preceding months, including increased withdrawal, unexplained absences, and visible injuries that Katie had attributed to accidents and self-harm. Mrs. Cardwell, Sophia's teacher, provided investigators with a timeline of her growing concerns, including an email sent to the principal 2 weeks before Sophia's death requesting a formal welfare check, which had been forwarded to social services but had not yet resulted in an unannounced home visit. The school nurse produced records of 6 visits by Sophia in the 3 months before her death, documenting complaints ranging from headaches and stomach pain to a sprained wrist that Katie had not sought medical treatment for, claiming it was attention-seeking behavior. The breakthrough in the investigation came at 11:43 that morning when Judge Marion Collins signed the warrant, allowing forensic examination of Katie Gallo's phone. Digital forensics specialist Tyler Chen began the extraction process immediately, creating a complete mirror of the device's contents before any remotely triggered deletion commands could be executed. Within the first hour of analysis, Chen discovered a text message thread between Katie and her sister spanning the previous 3 weeks, with the most recent exchange occurring at 6:15 that morning, more than an hour before Katie called 911. In these messages, Katie had written, "It's done. I'll call it in as we discussed when it's more believable that I just found her," to which Jenna had responded, "Remember everything we talked about. Stick to the story about the stairs and her behavior problems." This exchange, time-stamped and verified as authentic, directly contradicted Katie's statement that she had discovered Sophia unresponsive that morning and immediately called for help. By mid-afternoon on that first day, the Fairbanks Police Department had assembled a task force dedicated to the Sophia Martinez homicide investigation, with Detective Palmer as lead investigator coordinating specialized teams focused on forensic evidence, digital communications, witness interviews, and background investigation. The Alaska State Crime Lab dispatched additional personnel to assist with processing the extensive crime scene, which now included not just the Gallo residence, but Katie's vehicle and her workplace office at a local insurance agency. Medical examiner Dr. Priya Sharma conducted a preliminary examination of Sophia's body at the scene before authorizing transport to the morgue for a full autopsy, providing investigators with an initial determination that the child had been deceased for approximately 8 to 10 hours before the 911 call, and that strangulation was the likely cause of death, with multiple additional injuries indicating a pattern of abuse over time. The discovery of the text messages between Katie and her sister fundamentally altered the investigative approach, shifting from determination of whether a crime had occurred to building a case against an identified perpetrator. At 2:30 that afternoon, Detective Palmer conducted a formal recorded interview with Katie Gallo, beginning with Miranda warnings and the notification that she was now considered a suspect in Sophia's death. During this 3-hour interview, Palmer strategically revealed pieces of evidence, including selected text messages, to observe Katie's reactions and explanations. The interview video, later shown to the jury, documented Katie's progressive unraveling as her prepared narrative collapsed, beginning with confident denials, transitioning to claims that her texts were being misinterpreted, and ultimately attempting to shift blame to Sophia herself, claiming the child was dangerous and had pushed her to the breaking point. While Katie's interview was underway, a separate team led by Detective Mendez executed a search warrant at the home of Jenna Gallo Briggs, Katie's sister, located approximately 20 miles from the crime scene. This search yielded additional electronic devices, including a laptop with browsing, history revealing searches for how to delete text messages permanently and can police recover deleted messages, made that morning shortly after Katie's final text. Jenna was not at home during the search, having left for work before officers arrived, but was located and detained at her workplace, where she initially denied any knowledge of Sophia's death before being confronted with the text exchanges. Her subsequent statements attempting to characterize the messages as referring to disciplinary issues rather than homicide lacked credibility, but provided investigators with important insights into the extent of premeditation and the calculated nature of Katie's actions and attempted cover-up. The first day of investigation concluded with the formal arrest of Katie Gallo on charges of first-degree murder, with Jenna Gallo Briggs detained as a person of interest on potential charges of accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. A press conference held by Police Chief Thomas Hayes provided minimal details to the anxious community while emphasizing that the investigation was active and ongoing. Behind the scenes, investigators worked through the night processing digital evidence with the forensic team, making a critical discovery around midnight: a folder on Katie's phone containing screenshots of articles about child sociopathy and reactive attachment disorder, interspersed with photos of Sophia sleeping, and close-up images of minor scratches and bruises that appeared self-inflicted rather than caused by Sophia. This digital collection, time-stamped and organized, suggested not just premeditation, but an elaborate attempt to construct a justification narrative that Katie had been developing for weeks before the murder. The morning of January 8th brought the preliminary autopsy results from Dr. Sharma, confirming manual strangulation as the cause of death and documenting extensive additional injuries, including 3 healing rib fractures, a partially healed clavicle fracture, multiple contusions in various stages of healing, and signs of malnutrition and dehydration. Hair samples indicated the presence of sedatives not prescribed to Sophia, suggesting Katie had been drugging the child to manage her behavior. Most disturbing were the defensive wounds on Sophia's hands and forearms, indicating she had been conscious and fighting for her life during the final attack. The autopsy findings established a timeline indicating death had occurred between 9 and 10 the previous evening, with stomach contents suggesting Sophia had not been fed for at least 12 hours prior to death. This physical evidence, combined with the digital trail from Katie's phone, painted a horrific picture of calculated cruelty culminating in murder, contradicting every aspect of the accidental death narrative Katie had attempted to establish. As the investigation entered its second day, the focus expanded to include a comprehensive review of the foster care placement process that had brought Sophia into Katie Gallo's home. Records revealed that Katie and her husband James had been certified as foster parents 18 months earlier and had hosted 2 short-term placements before Sophia's arrival, neither of which had raised red flags in the system. James Gallo, reached by phone in Houston, where he was on an extended work assignment, expressed shock and disbelief at the allegations against his wife, claiming no knowledge of any abuse and describing his relationship with Sophia as cordial but distant due to his frequent travel. His financial records confirmed he had been away from the Fairbanks residence for 23 of the previous 30 days, placing him out of state during the escalation of abuse documented in Katie's text messages and at the time of Sophia's death. The text messages recovered from Katie Gallo's phone emerged as the centerpiece of the investigation, providing investigators with unprecedented insight into the mind of a killer. The exchanges between Katie and her sister Jenna revealed a narrative that had been carefully constructed over time, with Katie methodically building a case against 8-year-old Sophia that would later serve as justification for her actions. The earliest concerning message, sent 3 weeks before Sophia's death, read, "I don't know what to do about S anymore. There's something not right about the way she stares at me when she thinks I'm not looking." This seemingly innocent expression of concern would prove to be the first thread in a tapestry of fabricated fears that Katie wove around her young foster daughter, a narrative that grew increasingly dark and urgent as the days passed. Detective Ryan Palmer assembled a timeline of the text messages, tracking the evolution of Katie's characterization of Sophia from odd to concerning to dangerous over a remarkably short period. In messages from 2 weeks before Sophia's death, Katie wrote to her sister, I'm afraid of what she might do when I'm asleep. Caught her standing in the doorway of our bedroom last night just watching. Had to lock our door." When Jenna suggested this might be normal behavior for a child seeking reassurance, Katie's response was telling, "You don't understand. She's not normal. There's something wrong with her eyes. They're empty." This exchange was particularly significant to investigators as it coincided with Katie's installation of additional locks on bedroom doors throughout the house, purchases documented through credit card records and home improvement store surveillance footage, suggesting a calculated effort to support her fabricated narrative with physical evidence. The digital forensics team, led by specialist Tyler Chen, discovered that Katie had created a private photo album on her phone titled Evidence, containing hundreds of images of Sophia in various contexts, many surreptitiously taken while the child was sleeping or unaware she was being photographed. These images were often accompanied by notes interpreting normal childhood behaviors as sinister. A photo of Sophia yawning was captioned, "Plotting something," while an image of Sophia concentrating on homework bore the note, "Faking intelligence to manipulate teachers." Most disturbing was Katie's practice of photographing any minor household disturbance, from a misplaced toy to a glass of spilled milk, attributing them to Sophia's attempts to create chaos, even when timestamps and other evidence indicated Katie herself was likely responsible for staging these scenes. As the investigation deepened, Katie's sister, Jenna Gallo-Briggs, emerged as a complex figure in the narrative, part enabler, part reluctant accomplice. In the earlier exchanges, Jenna could be seen attempting to normalize Sophia's behavior, suggesting typical explanations for actions Katie found threatening. "All kids have nightmares and get up at night," she wrote, in response to one of Katie's concerned texts. "Remember how Katie's biological daughter used to sleepwalk? This isn't that different." However, as Katie's messages grew more insistent and elaborate, Jenna's resistance diminished, eventually shifting to active participation in constructing the narrative. By the week before Sophia's death, Jenna was offering suggestions for documenting Sophia's dangerous behavior and advising Katie to start telling her social worker about these incidents so there's a record when something bigger happens. The turning point in the message exchanges came 5 days before Sophia's death, when Katie wrote, "I can't keep doing this. She's going to hurt someone eventually, maybe Katie's biological children. No one will believe me until it's too late." Jenna's response marked her full conversion to Katie's perspective. "You need to protect your real kids. If the system won't remove her, you need to document everything. Make sure people know you tried to warn them." This exchange coincided with Katie's decision to keep Sophia home from school, effectively isolating her from any outside contact that might contradict the narrative Katie was building. School records confirmed that Katie called the school claiming Sophia had the flu, while text messages revealed her true motivation. "Keeping S home this week, can't risk her telling stories to that nosy teacher who keeps asking about her accidents." The most damning messages were those exchanged in the 48 hours before Sophia's death, revealing not just premeditation, but the methodical planning of both the crime and its cover-up. 3 days before the murder, Katie texted, "I had a long talk with S today about her behavior. Told her if she can't control her dangerous impulses, there will be serious consequences. She just stared at me with those empty eyes. She's not even human anymore." The following day, the messages took an even darker turn. "I can't sleep knowing she's in this house. I keep thinking about what could happen to Katie's biological children if," she snapped. "No one is taking this seriously enough." These messages aligned with Katie's internet search history from the same period, which included queries about undetectable poisons, how to tell if a child is a psychopath, and can foster parents request removal of a dangerous child. Perhaps most chilling were the messages exchanged between Katie and Jenna on the day of Sophia's murder. At 2:14 in the afternoon, Katie wrote, "Made a decision. Can't wait for the system to act. Will explain later." Jenna's response came quickly. "What are you talking about? Don't do anything crazy." Katie did not reply until 7:36 that evening. "Need to talk, not on text. Call me after 9 when she's asleep." Phone records confirmed a 23-minute call between the sisters at 9:15, shortly after the medical examiner estimated Sophia had been killed. The content of this call was not recorded, but it was followed by a text from Katie at 10:48. "It's done. We'll need your help with the story tomorrow." This exchange, more than any other piece of evidence, established both premeditation and Jenna's knowledge, if not active participation, in the planning and cover-up of Sophia's murder. As investigators continued analyzing the messages, they discovered a pattern of escalation that aligned with external events challenging Katie's control over her environment. The first significant increase in negative characterizations of Sophia coincided with a scheduled home visit by her social worker, suggesting Katie was preparing justifications for any concerns that might be raised. Another spike occurred following a parent-teacher conference, where Sophia's teacher expressed concern about the child's increasing withdrawal and unexplained injuries. Most tellingly, the final escalation leading to murder came after Katie received notification that Sophia's biological mother had made progress in her immigration case and was petitioning for supervised video visits with her daughter, threatening Katie's complete control over Sophia's narrative and potentially exposing the abuse that had been occurring. Beyond the text messages, Katie's digital footprint revealed an extensive effort to research and fabricate a case against Sophia. Her internet search history included queries about reactive attachment disorder symptoms, how to document child behavior problems, and can foster parents refuse to keep a child. She had joined online forums for foster parents dealing with difficult placements, where she shared increasingly alarming anecdotes about Sophia's supposedly dangerous behavior, receiving validation and advice from well-meaning but misled group members. In one forum post made 2 weeks before the murder, Katie wrote, "My foster daughter, 8, has been exhibiting scary behaviors, killing insects, drawing disturbing pictures, standing over our beds at night. Social services isn't taking my concerns seriously. Has anyone successfully documented these issues enough to get an emergency removal?" The responses encouraged more documentation and suggested strategies for convincing authorities of the seriousness of her claims. Katie's construction of Sophia as dangerous extended beyond digital communications to physical staging within the home. Security camera footage from the Gallo residence, recovered from Katie's cloud storage, showed her deliberately disarranging items in the house, then filming Sophia in the same area and claiming the child had caused the disorder. In one particularly disturbing video, Katie could be seen using a knife to make small cuts in her own arm in the bathroom, followed by her entering Sophia's room with the knife, placing it under the child's mattress, then discovering it on camera while Sophia was at school, narrating to the camera. "This is what I found hidden in S's room today. This is what I've been trying to warn everyone about." This methodical fabrication of evidence, captured on Katie's own security system that she apparently forgot, also archived to the cloud, demonstrated the elaborate lengths to which she went to support her fictional narrative about Sophia. The investigation also uncovered Katie's attempts to isolate Sophia from potential allies or witnesses who might contradict her characterization. In addition to the recent school absences, Katie had systematically canceled therapy appointments for Sophia, citing scheduling conflicts, but telling her sister via text, "Canceled S's therapy again. That counselor asked too many questions, and S is getting too comfortable telling her things." She had also restricted Sophia's contact with previous foster families who had maintained supportive relationships with the child, telling them Sophia was struggling with attachment issues and needed to focus on bonding with her new family without distractions. Most alarmingly, Katie had been intercepting and disposing of the letters Sophia attempted to send to her biological mother, discovered in a locked drawer in Katie's home office. Many of them opened and annotated in Katie's handwriting with comments like lies and manipulation attempts. As Detective Palmer reviewed the extensive digital evidence, a clear profile of Katie Gallo emerged, not as the overwhelmed foster parent pushed to the breaking point that her defense would later claim, but as a calculating individual who methodically constructed a false narrative to justify increasing abuse and ultimately murder. Her messages revealed not fear of Sophia, but irritation at the child's continued resilience and occasional non-compliance with Katie's rigid expectations. In one particularly revealing exchange, Katie complained to her sister, "S actually smiled and thanked me after I disciplined her for making a mess, like it was some kind of game. She's trying to make me look crazy when I report her behavior." This inversion of reality, interpreting a child's attempt to remain positive in the face of abuse as manipulation, provided investigators with crucial insight into Katie's distorted thinking and her growing determination to eliminate what she had come to perceive as a threat to her control and self-image. By the fourth day of investigation, the Fairbanks Police Department had compiled sufficient evidence to charge Katie Gallo with first-degree murder with special circumstances for the death of a child in her care, with additional charges of child abuse, false reporting, and evidence tampering. Jenna Gallo Briggs was charged as an accessory after the fact, with prosecutors weighing the possibility of additional charges based on her knowledge and potential encouragement of Katie's escalating behavior toward Sophia. The digital evidence, particularly the text messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death, had transformed what might otherwise have been a challenging circumstantial case into a documented journey of premeditation, providing investigators and prosecutors with unprecedented insight into the mind of a killer who had methodically planned both her crime and her defense. The prosecution's case against Katie Gallo centered on establishing a clear timeline of escalating abuse culminating in Sophia's murder, with the text messages as the foundation of their narrative. Assistant District Attorney Natalie King assembled a meticulous chronology integrating the digital evidence with physical findings, witness statements, and expert analysis to demonstrate not just that Katie had killed Sophia, but that she had done so with premeditation and had constructed an elaborate justification narrative in advance. The text messages exchanged between Katie and her sister provided prosecutors with a real-time documentation of Katie's evolving plans, allowing them to connect her digital communications with physical evidence in a way rarely possible in homicide cases. These text messages are essentially Katie Gallo's diary of death, Ada King told the investigative team during a case review meeting. She documented her own journey from annoyance to fabricated fear to murder, all while creating a parallel narrative of justification. Digital forensics specialist Tyler Chen expanded the investigation beyond Katie's phone to include all of her electronic devices and accounts, uncovering a comprehensive pattern of research and preparation. Katie's laptop contained a folder titled Sophia Documentation, with meticulously organized subfolders for behavioral incidents, property damage, and concerning artwork, all containing materials that investigators determined had been either fabricated or deliberately misinterpreted. Most disturbing was a spreadsheet titled Escalation Timeline, in which Katie had planned increasingly severe incidents to document, beginning with minor property damage allegedly caused by Sophia and culminating in entries labeled animal harm and threat to siblings that were scheduled for the weeks following Sophia's actual murder. This digital blueprint of Katie's planned campaign against Sophia provided prosecutors with clear evidence that the murder was not an impulsive act, but the culmination of a calculated plan to eliminate a child Katie had come to view as an obstacle. The physical evidence recovered from the Gallo home corroborated the story told by Katie's digital footprint. In Sophia's sparsely furnished bedroom, investigators discovered a hidden camera disguised as a smoke detector installed by Katie approximately 1 month before the murder. The footage from this camera, recovered from Katie's cloud storage, revealed Sophia engaging in perfectly normal childhood behaviors, reading books, completing homework, occasionally talking to herself or her stuffed rabbit, while Katie's notes and messages characterized these same activities as disturbing, manipulative, or rehearsed normal behavior to fool others. Of particular significance was footage from the night of Sophia's death, showing Katie entering the child's room at approximately 8:45, engaging in what appeared to be a heated one-sided conversation while Sophia sat motionless on her bed, followed by Katie advancing toward Sophia with the camera's view partially obscured but Sophia's feet visible, briefly struggling before going still. This footage, though not capturing the actual moment of strangulation, provided a timeline that precisely matched the medical examiner's determination of time of death and directly contradicted Katie's story about a fall down the stairs. The medical evidence formed another crucial pillar of the prosecution's case, with Dr. Priya Sharma's comprehensive autopsy findings revealing both the immediate cause of death and the pattern of abuse preceding it. Sophia's body bore 27 distinct bruises in various stages of healing, with the most recent injuries being the fatal strangulation marks and defensive wounds on her hands and forearms. Older injuries included healing fractures to 3 ribs, a partially healed clavicle fracture, and multiple contusions consistent with gripping, grabbing, and restraint rather than accidental falls. Toxicology results revealed the presence of diphenhydramine, Benadryl, at levels significantly higher than therapeutic dosing for a child of Sophia's size, suggesting Katie had been sedating Sophia to manage her behavior or ensure her compliance. Most significantly, the pattern of bruising around Sophia's neck was consistent with manual strangulation by adult hands, with distinctive finger-shaped contusions indicating a front-facing attack with significant force applied for at least 2 to 3 minutes, a duration that eliminated any possibility of an impulsive action and strongly suggested deliberate intent to kill. Sophia's school records and interviews with educational professionals provided the prosecution with a crucial counter-narrative to Katie's characterization of Sophia as dangerous or disturbed. Mrs. Cardwell, Sophia's second-grade teacher, supplied extensive documentation of Sophia's academic performance, social interactions, and classroom behavior, all of which portrayed a child who was academically capable, socially appropriate, if somewhat reserved, and displaying typical adjustment challenges for her situation, but no behaviors that would justify Katie's expressed concerns. Most significantly, Mrs. Cardwell had maintained a student observation journal, in which she documented Sophia's physical and emotional presentation each day, noting a marked decline beginning approximately 3 months before her death, coinciding with Katie's escalating abuse. Entries from this journal included observations like, Sophia came in with a long-sleeve shirt despite warm weather, noticed bruising on wrist when she reached for a book. When asked, she said she fell wrong and quickly pulled sleeve down, and 3rd absence this month. Katie called claiming flu symptoms, but Sophia was fine yesterday afternoon, growing concerned about pattern. The prosecution built a comprehensive timeline of the case against Katie Gallo, beginning with Sophia's placement in her home 8 months before the murder and tracking the evolution of Katie's behavior through 3 distinct phases. In the initial honeymoon phase, lasting approximately 2 months, Katie presented herself as the ideal foster parent, documenting Sophia's progress with positive social media posts and enthusiastic updates to the social worker. The second phase, identified as the disillusionment phase, began when Sophia's continued attachment to her biological mother and previous foster families appeared to trigger Katie's resentment, documented in early text messages to her sister expressing frustration that Sophia still asks about her real mom and doesn't appreciate everything I do for her. The final elimination phase began approximately 6 weeks before the murder, when Katie began actively constructing her narrative of Sophia as dangerous, coinciding with notification that Sophia's mother was making progress in her immigration case and might soon be granted virtual visitation rights, threatening Katie's complete control over Sophia's narrative and potentially exposing the ongoing abuse. A significant breakthrough in building the case came when investigators identified and interviewed previous foster children who had been placed with the gallows before Sophia. While none had experienced physical abuse reaching the level Sophia endured, both described Katie as rigidly controlling, prone to tests of loyalty and compliance, and quick to isolate them from outside support when they failed to meet her expectations. 15-year-old Marcus Jenkins, who had lived with the gallows for 6 weeks during an emergency placement, described how Katie had become increasingly hostile after he maintained regular contact with his biological mother, eventually engineering his removal by claiming he had threatened her. 11-year-old Zoe Anderson, who had been placed with the gallows for 4 months, reported that Katie had expected gratitude displays for basic necessities and had maintained a point system where infractions such as insufficient eye contact or inadequate enthusiasm resulted in privileges being revoked. Both former foster children described Katie's public persona as drastically different from her private behavior, with Zoe stating she was like two different people, super nice when anyone was watching, really cold when they weren't. The relationship between Katie and her sister Jenna emerged as a complicated element of the case, with prosecutors debating the extent of Jenna's criminal liability. While the text messages clearly established Jenna's knowledge of Katie's escalating behavior toward Sophia and her active participation in constructing the post-murder cover story, earlier exchanges suggested she had initially attempted to normalize Sophia's behavior and redirect Katie's growing fixation. Forensic psychologist Dr. Eleanor Winters, consulting for the prosecution, characterized their relationship as folie à deux in development, noting that Jenna had gradually surrendered her independent perspective in the face of Katie's increasingly insistent reality construction. Jenna's eventual cooperation with investigators, though coming only after she was confronted with the most damning evidence, provided additional insight into Katie's state of mind, including Jenna's admission that Katie had spoken of feeling trapped by Sophia's placement and resentful that the foster care stipend was less than she had expected. A critical aspect of the prosecution's case was establishing Katie Gallo's state of mind at the time of the murder, countering the anticipated defense claim of temporary insanity or extreme emotional distress. Dr. Winters conducted a thorough evaluation of Katie's digital communications, personal journals, and psychological assessment results, concluding that Katie showed no signs of psychosis or detachment from reality that would indicate an insanity defense was viable. Instead, Dr. Winters identified a pattern consistent with narcissistic personality traits, including Katie's evident belief that Sophia existed to fulfill Katie's self-image as a savior of troubled children, her rage when Sophia failed to show sufficient gratitude or attention, and her elaborate efforts to maintain her public image as a sacrificing foster mother while privately resenting and eventually targeting Sophia. Most significantly, Dr. Winters noted that Katie's messages showed clear awareness of social norms and legal boundaries, demonstrated by her careful construction of justifications and her methodical documentation of fabricated concerns. Behaviors inconsistent with someone in the grip of a psychotic break or overwhelming emotional distress. The financial aspects of Sophia's placement provided another dimension to the prosecution's case, establishing a potential motive beyond Katie's psychological issues. Financial records revealed that Katie had been experiencing economic pressure in the months leading up to the murder, with credit card debt exceeding $20,000 and a recent notification that her hours at the insurance agency where she worked would be reduced. While the foster care stipend for Sophia's placement was modest, approximately $700 monthly, investigators discovered that Katie had been misrepresenting household expenses to her husband James, claiming costs associated with Sophia's care were much higher than reality and pocketing the difference. Bank records showed that in the 7 months Sophia had lived with them, Katie had diverted approximately $6,000 of household funds for personal expenses, a scheme that would have been exposed if Sophia were removed from the home or if James became more directly involved in Sophia's care. This financial motivation, while secondary to the psychological factors, provided prosecutors with an additional dimension of premeditation and self-interest in Katie's decision to eliminate Sophia rather than requesting her placement be terminated through proper channels. As the case against Katie Gallo solidified, prosecutors faced the challenge of presenting the technical digital evidence in a way that would be compelling and comprehensible to a jury. Tyler Chen developed an innovative multimedia presentation that integrated the text messages with other evidence types, creating a day-by-day timeline that juxtaposed Katie's communications about Sophia, with contemporaneous evidence showing Sophia's actual condition and behavior. This presentation included split-screen comparisons showing, for example, Katie texting her sister about Sophia's disturbing, violent drawings alongside the actual artwork in question, typical childhood drawings of butterflies and rainbows that Katie had mischaracterized. Similarly, footage from the hidden camera in Sophia's room was presented alongside Katie's descriptions of the same time periods, highlighting the extreme disconnect between reality and Katie's fabricated narrative. This comprehensive approach to the digital evidence would prove crucial in helping jurors understand not just that Katie had killed Sophia, but the extensive premeditation and calculated deception that preceded the actual murder. Katie Gallo's formal arrest occurred at 6:15 in the evening on January 7th, approximately 11 hours after she had placed the 911 call reporting Sophia's accident. Detective Ryan Palmer read Katie her Miranda rights in an interview room at the Fairbanks Police Department, where she had been since that morning, initially as a witness, but increasingly as the focus of the investigation. The arrest followed the preliminary forensic analysis of Katie's phone and the medical examiner's confirmation that Sophia's injuries were consistent with homicide rather than an accidental fall. Katie's response to her arrest was captured on the interview room's video recording system, providing investigators and eventually jurors with a revealing glimpse into her psychological state. Rather than expressing shock or distress at being charged with her foster daughter's murder, Katie's first words after the Miranda warning were, "I want it noted that I repeatedly reported concerns about Sophia's behavior to social services, and nobody listened to me." The formal interrogation of Katie Gallo was conducted by Detective Palmer and Detective Olivia Mendez, both experienced in homicide investigations involving child victims and trained in specialized interviewing techniques for perpetrators of family violence. The strategy they employed, developed in consultation with forensic psychologist Dr. Eleanor Winters, was designed not primarily to elicit a confession, which they considered unlikely given Katie's extensive preparation and justification narrative, but to document her responses to specific evidence, particularly the text messages, that would later be powerful demonstrations of her culpability at trial. The detectives began with open-ended questions about Katie's relationship with Sophia, allowing her to establish her prepared narrative of being a concerned foster mother dealing with a troubled child, before methodically introducing contradictory evidence that challenged each aspect of that narrative. The turning point in the interrogation came approximately 40 minutes in, when Detective Palmer placed printed copies of Katie's text exchanges with her sister on the table. "I'd like to ask you about some communications we've recovered," he said, sliding a message dated 3 days before Sophia's death across the table. "I can't keep doing this. No one will believe me until it's too late." Katie's demeanor transformed instantly from composed confidence to defensive agitation. She first claimed the messages were being taken out of context, then attempted to characterize them as expressions of frustration common to all parents. When Palmer presented the message sent the night of Sophia's death, "It's done. We'll need your help with the story tomorrow," Katie's facade began to visibly crumble. She demanded a lawyer, ending the substantive questioning, but providing investigators with valuable insight into which evidence most directly challenged her prepared defenses. Following Katie's request for legal counsel, she was processed into the Fairbanks Correctional Center on charges of first-degree murder held without bail pending arraignment. The interrogation of her sister, Jenna Gallo Briggs, conducted simultaneously in a separate interview room, yielded more substantial information. Initially, Jenna attempted to maintain the narrative she and Katie had constructed, claiming that her sister had been genuinely concerned about Sophia's behavior and that their text exchanges reflected those legitimate worries. However, when Detective Mendez presented Jenna with the forensic analysis showing her attempted remote wipe of Katie's phone and her own internet searches about deleting text messages permanently, Jenna's position became untenable. Facing potential charges as an accessory to murder, Jenna began to distance herself from her sister's actions while providing investigators with crucial context for the communications leading up to Sophia's death. Jenna's statement, recorded and later transcribed as a 73-page document, revealed the evolution of Katie's fixation on Sophia and her own gradual entanglement in her sister's distorted reality. According to Jenna, Katie had initially been enthusiastic about fostering, viewing it as validation of her parenting abilities and enjoying the social validation it provided. Sophia's placement had seemed ideal at first, as the child was well-behaved, academically successful, and visibly eager to please her new foster parents. The shift in Katie's attitude began, Jenna stated, when Sophia maintained strong emotional connections to her biological mother and previous foster families, which Katie interpreted as disloyalty and ingratitude. Jenna described a phone call approximately 3 months before the murder in which Katie complained that Sophia keeps a picture of her real mom under her pillow and doesn't understand that I'm her mother now, revealing Katie's expectation that Sophia should transfer her attachment and identity to her new foster family completely. The most damning aspects of Jenna's statement concerned the final weeks before Sophia's death, when Katie's characterization of Sophia shifted from ungrateful to dangerous. Jenna admitted that while she initially questioned Katie's increasingly alarming descriptions of Sophia's behavior, suggesting alternative explanations or normalizing the described actions, she eventually began to accept her sister's version of reality, despite never personally witnessing any concerning behavior from Sophia during her visits to Katie's home. When asked directly about the night of Sophia's death, Jenna confirmed that Katie had called her around 9:15 immediately after the murder, saying only, "I took care of the problem. I need you to back me up tomorrow when I report an accident." Jenna stated that she had not fully understood what Katie meant until the following morning when Katie texted that Sophia was dead, at which point Jenna had participated in constructing the cover story about a fall down the stairs. Believing it was too late to do anything else, and wanting to protect her sister. While Katie refused further questioning after her initial interrogation, the evidence collected from her home and electronic devices continued to speak volumes about her actions and state of mind. Forensic analysis of her laptop revealed a document titled Sophia Incident Log, created 6 weeks before the murder, in which Katie had methodically documented fabricated behavioral concerns cross-referenced with research on conduct disorders and childhood psychopathy. The entries followed a clear pattern of escalation, beginning with relatively minor issues like refused to make eye contact during correction, and responded inappropriately to discipline with smiling, advancing to more serious allegations like found kitchen knife under bed and caught staring at sleeping siblings, many of which corresponded to stage photographs found on Katie's phone. The final entry, dated the day before Sophia's death, read simply, "Intervention necessary. Conventional methods have failed. Family safety must be prioritized." The forensic examination of the Gallo home yielded physical evidence that further contradicted Katie's narrative about Sophia and supported the charges against her. In Katie's home office, investigators discovered a locked cabinet containing 3 notebooks filled with handwritten observations about Sophia, dating back to her first day in the Gallo home. The early entries described Sophia in objectifying terms, focusing on her utility in enhancing Katie's self-image. S is perfect for social media posts. People at church were so impressed with our willingness to take her in. Entries from the middle period documented Katie's growing resentment of Sophia's continued attachment to her biological mother. Found S crying over her mother's photo again, told her that dwelling in the past was unhealthy and she needed to accept her new family. She apologized, but I could tell she didn't mean it. The final notebook, beginning approximately 2 months before the murder, contained increasingly delusional characterizations of normal childhood behaviors as sinister and calculated, with Katie describing Sophia's bedtime prayers as chanting something under her breath and interpreting a school art project as containing hidden violent imagery. The most disturbing physical evidence recovered from the Gallo residence was found in a locked safe in the master bedroom closet, to which Katie's husband James provided the combination when interviewed in Houston. Inside, investigators discovered a collection of items belonging to Sophia that Katie had confiscated, including letters Sophia had written to her mother but never been allowed to send, the photo of Sophia with her mother that she had kept under her pillow, and a small notebook containing Sophia's private thoughts. This notebook, which became known to the investigation team as Sophia's Diary, provided heartbreaking insight into the child's experience in Katie's home. Written in a child's uneven handwriting, entries included, "I'm trying to be good, but I always do things wrong. Mrs. Gallo says I need to forget my old mom, but I can't." And most disturbingly, a final entry dated 3 days before her death. "Mrs. Gallo says there's something bad inside me. I don't want to be bad. Maybe if I'm really good tomorrow, she'll let me call my mom for Christmas." The confiscation and hiding of these items demonstrated Katie's systematic effort to sever Sophia's connections to her identity and support system, isolating her completely before ultimately taking her life. In the days following Katie's arrest, investigators conducted extensive interviews with individuals who had interacted with Katie and Sophia, developing a comprehensive picture of Katie's public persona versus private behavior. Michelle Tran, Sophia's social worker, expressed profound guilt and grief when confronted with evidence of the abuse she had failed to detect during monthly home visits. She described Katie as always perfectly prepared for visits and very articulate about trauma-informed care, noting that she had occasionally questioned some of Katie's characterizations of Sophia's behavior, but had been persuaded by Katie's detailed documentation and apparent expertise. When shown the texts revealing Katie's coaching and threatening of Sophia before these visits, Tran broke down, recognizing how completely she had been manipulated by Katie's performance of concerned foster parenthood. This pattern of public deception extended to interviews with Katie's colleagues, fellow church members, and neighbors, all of whom expressed shock at the charges and described Katie as a dedicated, patient foster mother, who frequently spoke about the challenges of caring for a traumatized child, but always with apparent compassion and commitment. James Gallo, Katie's husband, became a figure of particular interest to investigators due to his frequent absences from the home and his potential knowledge of his wife's treatment of Sophia. Interviewed at length in Houston and later in Fairbanks after returning for Katie's arraignment, James presented as genuinely shocked by the allegations against his wife, describing their marriage as conventional but stable, with Katie taking primary responsibility for the children and household, while he focused on his career in petroleum engineering. Phone records confirmed James's account of regular check-in calls with Katie during his work assignments, but text exchanges between the couple contained minimal mention of Sophia beyond general updates about school and activities. When asked directly about his observations of Katie's interactions with Sophia, James admitted that he had deferred to Katie's expertise with the foster situation and had not developed a close relationship with Sophia himself, characterizing their interactions as polite but limited. Financial records indicated that James had been unaware of Katie's diversion of household funds, believing her reports that Sophia's care was more expensive than the foster stipend covered, a deception that supported the prosecution's theory that Katie had multiple motivations for maintaining Sophia's placement despite her growing resentment of the child. The most revealing aspect of Katie's interrogation was not what she said, but what the evidence said about her. When confronted with the text messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death, Katie's immediate response was not to deny sending them, but to insist they represented legitimate concerns about Sophia's behavior. Even when presented with the contradictory evidence, school records, testimony from Sophia's teachers, and footage from Katie's own hidden camera showing Sophia engaging in perfectly normal childhood behaviors, Katie maintained her characterization of Sophia as dangerous and manipulative. This inability to abandon her fabricated narrative even when confronted with irrefutable evidence contradicting it provided investigators and prosecutors with crucial insight into Katie's psychology and the extent of her detachment from reality. As Detective Palmer noted in his case summary, even after arrest, with the evidence overwhelming, Katie Gallo could not let go of the story she had created about Sophia. It had become more real to her than reality itself, a justification narrative so essential to her self-image that she clung to it even when it no longer served any practical purpose in her defense. The trial of Katie Gallo versus the state of Alaska began on June 3rd, 5 months after Sophia Martinez's murder in the Superior Court of Fairbanks. The courthouse, a modern 3-story structure of glass and concrete that stood in stark contrast to the historic buildings surrounding it, became the focal point of media attention and community grief as the case that had shocked the small city finally moved toward resolution. Security was unusually tight, with additional officers posted at all entrances due to the intense public interest and occasional demonstrations by both child welfare advocates calling for system reform and smaller groups supporting Katie who had been convinced by early defense statements suggesting Sophia had indeed been a troubled child. Inside the main courtroom, Judge Marshall Peterson presided over the proceedings, an experienced jurist known for running an efficient courtroom and for his particular attention to cases involving children. The jury selection process had been painstaking, lasting 7 days as attorneys from both sides worked to identify individuals who could fairly evaluate the disturbing evidence without being overwhelmed by emotional reactions to a case involving a child victim. The final jury consisted of 9 women and 3 men, ranging in age from 26 to 71, including a retired teacher, a nurse, an accountant, a construction worker, and a university administrator, among others. 4 alternates were also selected, a higher number than usual given the anticipated length of the trial and the potential for jurors to request recusal after viewing some of the more disturbing evidence. Judge Peterson had instructed the jury regarding the sensitive nature of the case, emphasizing their duty to consider only the evidence presented and to set aside any personal feelings about crimes against children while acknowledging the natural difficulty of doing so. Assistant District Attorney Natalie King opened for the prosecution with a methodical presentation that established the core narrative of their case. Rather than beginning with emotional appeals, King started by displaying the timeline of text messages between Katie and her sister, presenting them as the foundation upon which the state would build its case. The evidence will show that Katie Gallo methodically constructed a false narrative about 8-year-old Sofia Martinez, portraying a normal, well-behaved child as dangerous and disturbed, culminating in the message sent to her sister just days before Sofia's death. "I'm afraid of what she might do," King told the jury. But the evidence will also show that it was not Sofia who was dangerous, but Katie Gallo herself. This approach immediately centered the foundational evidence of the text messages, establishing their crucial role in documenting Katie's premeditation and calculation before the jury had heard any testimony or seen any physical evidence. King continued by outlining the 3 pillars of the state's case: the digital evidence showing Katie's premeditation and construction of a justification narrative, the physical and forensic evidence demonstrating the pattern of abuse culminating in murder, and the testimony from numerous witnesses who would contradict Katie's characterization of Sofia. She was careful to prepare the jury for the disturbing nature of some of the evidence they would see, particularly the autopsy photos and the video from the hidden camera in Sofia's room that partially captured her final moments. "What makes this case unique," King explained, "is that the defendant documented her own journey toward murder, leaving behind an unprecedented digital trail that allows us to see not just what she did, but how methodically she planned it and justified it to herself." This framing established the prosecution's central argument that Sofia's murder was not a momentary loss of control, but the culmination of a calculated campaign against a vulnerable child. Defense attorney Mark Calloway, appointed to represent Katie when her financial assets were frozen pending investigation, presented a starkly different opening narrative. Calloway, a former prosecutor himself with 20 years of defense experience, acknowledged the difficulty of the case from the outset. "What happened to Sofia Martinez was a tragedy, and nothing I say in this courtroom is intended to diminish that fact," he began, establishing a tone of somber recognition that avoided appearing callous while maintaining his client's presumption of innocence. Calloway's strategy focused on portraying Katie as an overwhelmed foster parent who had genuinely, if misguidedly, come to believe that Sofia presented a danger to her family. The messages you will see do not show premeditation for murder, but the increasingly desperate pleas of a woman who believed the system had abandoned her with a troubled child she was not equipped to handle, he argued, attempting to reframe the central evidence in a way that would support a lesser charge of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. Calloway went on to outline the defense's 3 main arguments: that Katie's concerns about Sofia, while ultimately unfounded, were sincerely held rather than fabricated, that the foster care system had failed both Sofia and Katie by providing inadequate support and supervision, and that Katie's actions represented an extreme and tragic response to perceived threats rather than calculated murder. He introduced the concept of caretaker breakdown syndrome, a controversial theory not widely accepted in psychology, but occasionally used in defense strategies, suggesting that the stresses of caring for a traumatized child had caused Katie to develop distorted perceptions and ultimately to act in ways she would not have under normal circumstances. This approach aimed to establish reasonable doubt about Katie's premeditation and to lay groundwork for a potential plea or verdict on lesser charges, acknowledging that the evidence of Katie's direct responsibility for Sophia's death would be difficult to dispute entirely. The first witness called by the prosecution was Dr. Priya Sharma, the medical examiner who had performed Sophia's autopsy. Dr. Sharma, a slight woman with steel-gray hair and precise gestures, presented her findings with clinical detachment that somehow made the details all the more powerful. Using anatomical diagrams rather than the actual autopsy photos in her initial testimony, those would be introduced later when the jury had been better prepared, Dr. Sharma walked the court through her determination of the cause and manner of death. Sophia Martinez died of manual strangulation, as evidenced by the pattern of bruising around her neck, fracture of the hyoid bone, and petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and facial tissues, she testified. The force required to cause these injuries is substantial, and the duration of application necessary to result in death would be at minimum 2 to 3 minutes, likely longer given the victim's age and the size differential between her and an adult assailant. Dr. Sharma then expanded her testimony to include the evidence of longer-term abuse, methodically documenting the 27 distinct bruises found on Sophia's body, each photographed, measured, and aged based on healing progression. These injuries were in various stages of healing, indicating they were inflicted over a period of weeks rather than all at once, she explained, using a color-coded body diagram to illustrate the timeline of injuries. Particularly concerning were the healing fractures to 3 ribs on the left side and a partially healed clavicle fracture, injuries that would have caused significant pain and would typically result from substantial blunt force trauma. When asked by Ada King whether any of these injuries were consistent with accidental falls, as suggested in Katie's initial explanation to emergency services, Dr. Sharma was unequivocal. The pattern, location, and progression of these injuries is inconsistent with accidental trauma and highly consistent with inflicted injury over time. During cross-examination, defense attorney Calloway focused on establishing that Dr. Sharma could not definitively state Katie Gallo was the person who inflicted these injuries, attempting to introduce doubt about whether Sophia might have experienced abuse from another source. Dr. Sharma acknowledged the scientific limitation that physical evidence alone cannot identify the specific perpetrator, but noted that the timeline of injuries corresponded with Sophia's placement in the Gallo home and that the most recent injuries, including the fatal strangulation, had occurred within a time frame when Katie was the only adult present in the home. Calloway also questioned Dr. Sharma about the presence of diphenhydramine in Sophia's system, attempting to suggest that its presence could indicate Sophia was being treated for legitimate medical issues. But Dr. Sharma maintained that the levels found were significantly higher than therapeutic dosing for a child of Sophia's age and weight, consistent with sedation rather than treatment of allergic symptoms. The second day of trial brought Detective Ryan Palmer to the stand as the prosecution's next key witness. Detective Palmer, with his weathered face and deliberate speech, presented as the embodiment of methodical investigation as he walked the jury through the crime scene at the Gallo residence. Using a digital reconstruction of the home displayed on screens throughout the courtroom, Palmer guided jurors through what investigators had found, contrasting Katie's claim of an accidental fall down the stairs with the physical evidence that contradicted this account. There were no signs of disturbance on or near the staircase, Palmer testified, showing photographs of the immaculate stairs. No scuff marks, no impact points, no transfer of material that would indicate a significant fall had occurred there. Additionally, the distance from the stairs to Sophia's bedroom where her body was found made it implausible that she could have been moved there without assistance after a traumatic fall, particularly given the nature of her injuries as later determined by the medical examiner. Palmer's testimony then shifted to the discovery and analysis of Katie's text messages, the foundational evidence that had broken the case open. The prosecution had prepared a multimedia presentation that displayed the messages chronologically, with Palmer providing context for each key exchange between Katie and her sister Jenna. What was particularly significant about these communications, Palmer explained, was the contrast between the behavior Katie was describing and what we were able to verify through other sources. For example, this message from January 2nd, 3 days before Sophia's death, reads, "Caught S going through kitchen drawers looking for knives again. Had to lock everything sharp in the garage." However, the video from Katie's own security system for that same time period shows Sophia getting a spoon from the drawer to eat yogurt, a normal everyday action that Katie had completely mischaracterized in her communication with her sister. The most powerful moment of Palmer's testimony came when the prosecution introduced the footage from the hidden camera Katie had installed in Sophia's bedroom. Before playing the video, Ada King requested a brief recess to allow any jurors who needed a moment to prepare themselves for what would be disturbing content. When the court reconvened, the footage was played showing Katie entering Sophia's room on the evening of January 6th, engaging in what appeared to be an agitated monologue while Sophia sat motionless on her bed. Though the audio was of poor quality, forensic enhancement had clarified enough of Katie's words for Palmer to testify about what was being said. Katie Gallo can be heard telling Sophia that she is tired of pretending and that Sophia doesn't appreciate the sacrifices being made for her. She also says, "No one understands what I'm dealing with, and you've left me no choice," before advancing toward Sophia. The video did not capture the actual strangulation due to the camera angle, but Sophia's feet could be seen briefly struggling at the edge of the frame before going still, a moment that caused several jurors to visibly react despite their preparation. On cross-examination, defense attorney Calloway focused on what the video did not show, emphasizing that the final moments of the interaction between Katie and Sophia were partially off-camera, and that the audio quality made it impossible to hear Sophia's responses, if any, to Katie's statements. "Is it possible," Calloway asked, "that something occurred off-camera that escalated the situation beyond what we can see?" Palmer acknowledged the technical limitation, but pointed out that the video timeline matched exactly with phone records showing Katie's call to her sister Jenna at 9:15, immediately after Sophia's estimated time of death, followed by the text message stating, "It's done," establishing a sequence that strongly supported premeditation rather than a spontaneous response to an unforeseen provocation. Calloway also questioned Palmer about whether investigators had pursued other potential suspects, to which Palmer replied that the overwhelming physical and digital evidence had clearly established Katie as the sole perpetrator, with no credible alternative suspects identified during the investigation. The third day of trial focused on the digital forensics aspect of the case, with specialist Tyler Chen taking the stand to explain the technical recovery and analysis of Katie's electronic communications. Chen, whose youthful appearance belied his extensive expertise, used simplified explanations and visual aids to help the jury understand the sophisticated techniques used to recover and authenticate the digital evidence. Even when messages are deleted from a device, Chen explained, they often leave traces in the device's storage that can be recovered using specialized tools. Additionally, in this case, many of the messages existed in multiple locations: on Katie Gallo's phone, in cloud backups, and on her sister's devices, allowing for cross-verification of their authenticity. This testimony was crucial in establishing the reliability of the text messages as evidence preemptively addressing potential defense arguments about the possibility of manipulation or misinterpretation of the digital content. Chen's most significant contribution to the prosecution's case was his presentation of the broader pattern of digital evidence beyond the text messages themselves. He had compiled a comprehensive digital timeline that incorporated Katie's internet search history, document creation and modification dates, photo and video timestamps, and communication patterns across multiple platforms. What emerged from this analysis, Chen testified, was a clear progression from Katie Gallo researching terms like difficult foster child and adoption disruption, approximately 3 months before Sophia's death, to more concerning searches for signs of child psychopathy and how to document behavioral problems 2 months before, culminating in searches for undetectable poisons and can foster parents be forced to keep dangerous children in the weeks immediately preceding the murder. This digital breadcrumb trail, methodically presented in both chronological and thematic groupings, provided the jury with compelling evidence of Katie's premeditation and her construction of a justification narrative well before the actual killing. The defense's cross-examination of Chen focused on technical questions about the certainty of attribution, whether it could be definitively proven that Katie herself had conducted the searches and written the messages attributed to her. Chen acknowledged that digital forensics cannot always establish with absolute certainty who physically typed at a keyboard, but pointed to the pattern of consistent access from Katie's personal devices, the authentication through biometric locks on her phone, and the linguistic analysis showing consistent writing patterns across platforms. While no single digital artifact provides absolute certainty of user identity, Chen explained, the cumulative pattern across multiple devices, accounts, and platforms establishes an attribution certainty that meets and exceeds forensic standards. This technical but accessible explanation effectively neutralized a potential avenue of doubt that the defense had hoped to exploit. As the first week of trial concluded, the prosecution had established a solid foundation for their case, with the medical evidence proving Sophia had been murdered rather than suffering an accident, the crime scene investigation contradicting Katie's initial explanation, and the digital evidence documenting her premeditation and calculated construction of a justification narrative. The text messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death had been firmly established as part of a broader pattern of deception rather than genuine concern, with multiple forms of evidence demonstrating the disconnect between Katie's characterizations of Sophia and the child's actual behavior and condition. The jury, initially reserved in their reactions, had become visibly engaged with the evidence, several taking extensive notes during testimony and watching the witnesses intently. The stage was set for the second week of trial, where the human dimension of the case would take center stage through testimony from those who had known Sophia and Katie, providing context for the clinical evidence already presented. The second week of trial began with testimony from Sophia's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Rachel Cardwell, whose evidence would prove pivotal in dismantling Katie Gallo's characterization of Sophia as dangerous or disturbed. Mrs. Cardwell, a veteran educator with 27 years of classroom experience, presented as a composed, articulate witness who had clearly been deeply affected by Sophia's death, but remained professional in her testimony. She brought to court her detailed student observation journal, a practice she had maintained throughout her teaching career, documenting each child's academic progress, social interactions, and any concerns that arose. This contemporaneous record, created without knowledge that it would later become evidence in a murder trial, provided an unbiased window into Sophia's actual behavior and condition during the months leading up to her death. Sophia Martinez joined my classroom in May of the previous school year, after her placement with the Gallo family, Mrs. Cardwell testified. Initially, she presented as a quiet but engaged student, clearly intelligent and eager to please, though understandably reserved given the significant transitions she had experienced. Using her journal entries as reference, Cardwell walked the jury through Sophia's first months in her classroom, describing a child who quickly formed appropriate friendships with classmates, demonstrated above-average academic skills, particularly in reading and mathematics, and showed no behavioral issues beyond occasional distraction that Cardwell characterized as entirely typical for a second grader, particularly one processing the kind of disruption Sophia had experienced in her young life. This portrait stood in stark contrast to Katie's text messages from the same period describing Sophia as manipulative, calculating, and showing concerning behaviors that required constant monitoring. The most powerful aspect of Mrs. Cardwell's testimony was her documentation of Sophia's gradual change as the abuse in the Gallo home escalated. Referring to journal entries from October, approximately 3 months before Sophia's death, Cardwell noted, "I observed a marked shift in Sophia's demeanor and physical presentation. She became increasingly withdrawn, less willing to participate in group activities, and began wearing long sleeves regardless of the classroom temperature." With permission from the court, Cardwell read directly from her journal entry, dated October 12th. Sophia arrived with visible fatigue and flinched when Marco accidentally bumped her desk. When I quietly asked if she was feeling okay, she whispered, "I'm fine, just didn't sleep good," then looked toward the door as if concerned someone might overhear. Made a note to follow up and observe for pattern. This contemporaneous observation, recorded without knowledge of what was occurring in the Gallo home, provided powerful corroboration of the timeline established by other evidence showing when Katie's abuse of Sophia had intensified. Mrs. Cardwell's testimony also included her documentation of specific injuries she had observed and reported, along with Katie Gallo's explanations for each. On November 3rd, I noticed bruising on Sophia's wrist when her sleeve rode up as she reached for a book. When I inquired about it during recess, Sophia looked down and said she fell wrong. I documented this and contacted Katie Gallo, who explained that Sophia had tripped over a toy and braced her fall awkwardly. Cardwell had included Katie's exact wording in her journal. Katie stated, "Sophia's been going through a clumsy phase lately. The pediatrician says it's normal for her age, but we're keeping an eye on it. Thank you for your concern." Assistant District Attorney King then showed the jury a text message Katie had sent to her sister that same day. "S's teacher called about the bruise. Fed her the clumsiness story, she bought it. Might need to be more careful about visible marks." The juxtaposition of Cardwell's contemporaneous documentation with Katie's private communication effectively demonstrated the calculated deception Katie had employed to conceal her abuse of Sophia. On cross-examination, defense attorney Calloway attempted to suggest that Mrs. Cardwell might have missed signs of behavioral issues in Sophia, questioning whether the teacher had the expertise to distinguish between normal childhood behavior and more concerning patterns that might emerge only in a home environment. Cardwell's response was measured but firm. "In 27 years of teaching, I have worked with children experiencing a wide range of challenges, including trauma, attachment disorders, and various behavioral conditions. I've received specialized training in identifying concerning behaviors, and am a mandatory reporter who takes that responsibility very seriously. Nothing in Sophia's classroom behavior even approached the concerning characteristics Katie Gallo described in her communications. When pressed about whether Sophia might have behaved differently at home than at school, Cardwell acknowledged this possibility, but noted, "While children may certainly present differently in different environments, the extreme behaviors Katie described would typically manifest in some form in the classroom environment as well, particularly over the 8 months Sophia was in my class. I observed no behaviors that would support Katie's characterizations. Following Mrs. Cardwell's compelling testimony, the prosecution called Dr. Eleanor Winters, the forensic psychologist who had analyzed Katie Gallo's communications and psychological evaluation results. Dr. Winters, with her precise language and commanding presence, provided the jury with a framework for understanding the psychological dynamics revealed in Katie's text messages and other communications. What we see in these messages is not the documentation of a child's dangerous behavior, but rather a process psychologists refer to as narrative construction, Dr. Winters explained. Katie Gallo was actively creating a story about Sophia that served her psychological needs, regardless of whether that story corresponded to reality. This narrative began as minor complaints about typical child behaviors, but progressively incorporated more extreme characterizations as Katie's resentment and desire to remove Sophia from her life intensified. Dr. Winters identified several key psychological patterns evident in Katie's communications, illustrating each with specific examples from the text messages and Katie's journal entries. We see clear evidence of what's called confirmation bias. Katie interpreted even the most innocent behaviors through the lens of her constructed narrative. For example, when Sophia made her bed without being asked, Katie wrote to her sister, "S is trying too hard to appear perfect. It's creepy and manipulative," rather than recognizing this as positive, helpful behavior. Dr. Winters went on to explain how Katie's psychological testing revealed narcissistic traits that made her particularly vulnerable to perceived rejection. When Sophia maintained attachment to her biological mother and didn't immediately transfer that attachment to Katie, Katie experienced this not as a normal and healthy aspect of a child's psychological development, but as a personal rejection and a threat to her self-image as the savior of this child. Perhaps the most important aspect of Dr. Winters' testimony was her explanation of the concept of psychological projection as it applied to the case. In the text messages expressing fear of the girl, what we're actually seeing is Katie projecting her own hostile impulses onto Sophia. When she writes, "I'm afraid of what she might do," she is actually, on a subconscious level, expressing awareness of what she herself is contemplating doing. Dr. Winters explained how this projection served a psychological purpose for Katie. By constructing Sophia as dangerous, Katie was creating a justification, narrative that allowed her to view her own escalating abusive behavior as protective rather than harmful, and ultimately to view the murder itself as a necessary action rather than a crime. This psychological context helped the jury understand not just what Katie had done, but the thought processes that had led to such a horrific act against a vulnerable child in her care. During cross-examination, defense attorney Calloway challenged Dr. Winters' analysis, suggesting she had interpreted the evidence through a biased lens, given that she had been retained by the prosecution. Dr. Winters calmly pointed out that her methodology followed established forensic psychological practices, including consideration of alternative explanations and application of multiple analytical frameworks to the evidence. When Calloway suggested that Katie's concerns about Sophia might have been genuine, even if ultimately unfounded, Dr. Winters acknowledged the theoretical possibility, but pointed to the pattern of evidence. While a caregiver could certainly misinterpret a child's behavior out of genuine concern, what we see in this case is a systematic construction of a false narrative that conveniently served the defendant's apparent desire to remove Sophia from her life. The timing of the escalation in this narrative, coinciding with notification that Sophia's mother might soon have virtual visitation rights, strongly suggests motivation beyond simple misinterpretation. The prosecution's next key witness was Jenna Gallo Briggs, Katie's sister, who had accepted a plea agreement on charges of accessory after the fact in exchange for her testimony. Jenna's appearance in court created a moment of high drama, as it marked the first time she and Katie had seen each other since their arrests 5 months earlier. Jenna, visibly thinner than in her booking photos, and dressed conservatively in a navy blue blazer and gray slacks, avoided looking directly at her sister as she took the stand, focusing instead on Assistant District Attorney King as she was sworn in. Katie, for her part, stared intently at Jenna throughout her testimony, her expression oscillating between hurt and anger as her sister's account further dismantled her defense. Jenna's testimony began with establishing the close relationship she had shared with her sister throughout their lives, providing context for how she had become entangled in Katie's distorted narrative about Sophia. Katie and I have always been very close, just 15 months apart in age. We've relied on each other through our parents' divorce, our own marriages and careers, everything, Jenna explained. When Katie decided to become a foster parent, I was supportive, but also a little concerned because she's always been very particular about how things should be done. This subtle introduction of Katie's controlling tendencies was expanded upon as Jenna described her observations of Katie's interactions with Sophia. At first, Katie seemed genuinely excited about fostering Sophia. She talked about how well-behaved Sophia was, how smart she was, how this placement was going to be perfect for everyone. The shift in Katie's attitude toward Sophia was a central aspect of Jenna's testimony, providing a timeline that corroborated other evidence about when the abuse had begun to escalate. I started noticing a change in how Katie talked about Sophia around September, after Sophia had been with them for about 4 months, Jenna testified. Katie became increasingly irritated by normal child behaviors, Sophia asking questions, wanting attention, mentioning her mother. Katie would text me things like, S asked about calling her real mom again today. After everything I do for her, you'd think she'd be more grateful. Or S cried when she couldn't find her stuffed rabbit. So dramatic and manipulative. When asked by Ada King whether she had expressed concern about these characterizations, Jenna admitted, "At first, I did push back. I'd remind Katie that Sophia was just a child who'd been through a lot. But Katie would get defensive, saying I couldn't possibly understand because I wasn't there all day with Sophia. Over time, I started questioning my own reactions, wondering if maybe Katie was right, and I just wasn't seeing what she was seeing." The most difficult part of Jenna's testimony concerned the events immediately surrounding Sophia's death, particularly the phone call she received from Katie around 9:15 on the evening of January 6th. "Katie called me and said, 'It's done. I took care of it,'" Jenna recounted, her voice noticeably strained. "I asked what she meant, and she said, 'The Sophia problem. She won't be hurting anyone now.' I still didn't fully understand, but I felt sick, like something terrible had happened. Katie said she would call me in the morning with more details and that I needed to back up her story about an accident." When asked by Ada King why she hadn't immediately called authorities if she suspected something had happened to Sophia, Jenna paused for several long seconds before responding, "I wish I could say I didn't really understand what she meant, but on some level, I think I did. I just couldn't face it. Katie is my sister. I've always protected her. It's the biggest regret of my life that I didn't protect Sophia instead." Jenna went on to describe the text messages exchanged with Katie the following morning, including Katie's instructions about the cover story they had constructed, claiming Sophia had fallen down the stairs. Katie texted me around 6:15 saying she was going to call 911 in about an hour, that she needed to make it look like she'd just discovered Sophia. She reminded me to stick to the story about Sophia's behavior problems and the accident, said we needed to be consistent. Jenna confirmed that she had initially followed this plan, even attempting to remotely wipe Katie's phone when she realized police had confiscated it before, ultimately cooperating with investigators after being confronted with evidence of her involvement. When Detective Mendez showed me the text messages and explained what they had found in Katie's home, the hidden camera, the journal entries, the way Sophia had been treated, I couldn't keep denying what had happened anymore. It was like waking up from some horrible trance where I'd somehow convinced myself that helping my sister was more important than the truth about what happened to that little girl. On cross-examination, defense attorney Calloway focused on inconsistencies in Jenna's initial statements to police versus her current testimony, attempting to characterize her as an unreliable witness motivated primarily by her plea agreement rather than a desire for truth. Isn't it true that when first questioned, you told detectives that Katie had genuine concerns about Sophia's behavior? Calloway asked. Jenna acknowledged this, responding, "Yes, initially I repeated what Katie had been telling me for months. I was trying to protect my sister. It was only after seeing the evidence and really confronting what had happened that I could admit the truth, that Katie had been constructing this narrative about Sophia, and I had gradually been drawn into believing it despite never personally seeing any concerning behavior from Sophia myself." This admission of her own complicity, rather than weakening her credibility, seemed to strengthen it in the eyes of the jury, who could observe her genuine remorse and struggle with her role in the events. The testimony of James Gallo, Katie's husband, provided yet another perspective on the case, though his limited presence in the home during the relevant period somewhat restricted the impact of his evidence. James, a tall man with a corporate bearing who appeared uncomfortable in the witness box, testified that he had been away on business for approximately 70% of Sophia's placement with them, including the 3 weeks leading up to her death. "My work as a petroleum engineering consultant requires extensive travel to remote sites, often for weeks at a time," he explained. Katie managed the household and the children's care, including all aspects of fostering. While I supported the decision to become foster parents, the day-to-day reality was primarily Katie's responsibility. This testimony established James's limited, direct knowledge of the dynamics between Katie and Sophia, while also potentially supporting the defense's narrative about the pressures Katie faced managing the household largely alone. When questioned about his observations of Katie's interactions with Sophia during the periods he was home, James provided testimony that inadvertently revealed inconsistencies in Katie's treatment of their foster daughter. Katie was always very structured with Sophia. There were clear rules and expectations, which Katie explained were important for a child who had experienced disruption. When asked whether these rules differed from those applied to their biological children, James hesitated before acknowledging, yes, there were different standards for Sophia. Katie said this was based on advice from books about fostering traumatized children, that Sophia needed more structure and clearer consequences than our biological children who had grown up with consistent parenting from birth. This acknowledgement of the differential treatment, though James presented it as therapeutic rather than punitive, corroborated other evidence of Katie's isolation and targeting of Sophia within the family structure. The most damaging aspect of James's testimony came when Assistant District Attorney King asked about his awareness of Sophia's living conditions, specifically the cold temperature maintained in her room, the locks on the outside of her door, and the hidden camera Katie had installed. James appeared genuinely shocked by some of these details, stating, "I knew Sophia's room had a lock," which Katie said was necessary because Sophia had been sleepwalking and they were concerned about her safety on the stairs at night. "I was not aware of the temperature issue. I traveled so frequently that I rarely went into Sophia's room, and Katie managed the household thermostats." Regarding the hidden camera, James claimed complete ignorance. I had no idea Katie had installed any kind of surveillance in Sophia's room. That was never discussed with me. This testimony suggested that Katie had deliberately concealed aspects of her treatment of Sophia even from her husband, undermining the defense's position that her actions represented an open response to genuine concerns. The final key witness for the prosecution was Michelle Tran, the social worker assigned to Sophia's case, whose testimony addressed the systemic failures that had allowed the abuse to continue undetected. Tran, a woman in her mid-30s whose professional composure occasionally cracked with emotion during her testimony, described the monthly home visits she had conducted at the Gallo residence and her interactions with both Katie and Sophia during these supervised encounters. Katie was always very well prepared for scheduled visits, Tran explained. The house was immaculate, Sophia was always appropriately dressed and groomed, and Katie had detailed documentation of Sophia's activities, schoolwork, and any issues that had arisen since the previous visit. This preparation, which had initially impressed Tran as indicative of Katie's commitment to fostering, was revealed through other evidence to have involved extensive coaching and threatening of Sophia before each visit, with Katie instructing the child exactly what to say and warning of consequences if she deviated from the script. When asked about her direct interactions with Sophia during these visits, Tran admitted that the child had shown signs of distress that she had failed to properly investigate. Sophia was always very quiet during our one-on-one conversations, answering questions minimally and frequently looking toward Katie for what seemed like guidance on how to respond. Tran acknowledged that she had noted this behavior in her reports, but had interpreted it as anxiety related to Sophia's past experiences, rather than fear of her current situation. In retrospect, there were red flags I should have recognized. Sophia's increasing withdrawal, her reluctance to discuss her daily life in the Gallo home, the way she flinched at sudden movements. The system failed Sophia, and I was part of that system. This honest acknowledgement of professional failure, delivered with evident remorse, had a visible impact on the jury, while also providing context for how Katie had been able to maintain her facade of appropriate fostering despite the abuse occurring behind closed doors. Through these key witnesses, the prosecution established a comprehensive picture of Katie Gallo's methodical construction of a false narrative about Sophia, the systematic abuse that had occurred in the Gallo home, and the calculated nature of the murder itself. The text messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death were firmly established not as genuine concerns about a troubled child, but as part of a deliberate campaign to justify Katie's increasingly abusive behavior and, ultimately, the elimination of a child she had come to resent. As the prosecution rested its case at the end of the second week of trial, the evidence against Katie Gallo appeared overwhelming, with the defense facing the daunting challenge of countering not just the physical evidence of Sophia's murder, but the digital trail documenting Katie's premeditation and calculated deception. After 8 days of testimony and presentation of evidence, the prosecution rested its case against Katie Gallo. The defense, faced with overwhelming evidence of Katie's guilt, presented a significantly abbreviated case focusing primarily on Katie's mental state rather than disputing the factual allegations. Defense attorney Mark Calloway called only 3 witnesses: a forensic psychiatrist who testified about the stresses of foster parenting traumatized children, a former neighbor who described Katie as a dedicated mother to her biological children, and Katie Gallo herself, whose decision to testify against the advice of her attorney would prove to be a pivotal moment in the trial. Throughout the defense's presentation, Calloway attempted to reframe the narrative from premeditated murder to a tragic breakdown of an overwhelmed caregiver seeking to generate enough sympathy or reasonable doubt to avoid a first-degree murder conviction. Katie Gallo's testimony, beginning on the trial's 9th day, represented her first public statement about Sophia's death beyond her initial claims to emergency responders. Dressed in a modest navy dress and wearing minimal makeup, Katie presented herself as composed and articulate, though observers noted a flatness to her affect that seemed at odds with the emotional gravity of the situation. Under direct examination by Calloway, Katie acknowledged that Sophia had died by her hand, but maintained that she had genuinely believed the child presented a danger to her family. "I know now that I was wrong about Sophia," Katie testified, "but at the time, I truly believed she was capable of harming my biological children. Everything I did was out of a misguided attempt to protect them." This qualified admission of responsibility, while still maintaining the core of her justification narrative, appeared calculated to support the defense's strategy of seeking conviction on lesser charges of manslaughter rather than premeditated murder. As Katie's testimony continued, however, it became apparent that she remained unable to fully acknowledge the reality of her actions or to express genuine remorse for Sophia's death. When asked about the text messages expressing fear of Sophia, Katie maintained, "Those were my real feelings at the time. I had convinced myself that Sophia was dangerous because I couldn't handle the stress of caring for a child who wouldn't attach to me, who was still so connected to her biological mother." This partial insight into her psychological motivations was undercut by her continued characterization of Sophia as the source of the problem, rather than the victim of Katie's distorted perceptions. Even when discussing the actual killing, Katie described it in passive, distancing terms. Things escalated that evening. There was a confrontation. Sophia ended up dead. This linguistic evasion of direct responsibility, despite her technical admission of causing Sophia's death, struck many observers as further evidence of Katie's narcissistic inability to fully acknowledge the horror of what she had done. Assistant District Attorney Natalie King's cross-examination of Katie proved devastating to the defense's strategy of portraying her as an overwhelmed caregiver who had experienced a momentary breakdown. With methodical precision, King walked Katie through the timeline established by the text messages, the staged photographs, and the hidden camera footage, repeatedly contrasting Katie's claims of genuine concern with the evidence of her calculated deception. "You testified that you truly believed Sophia was dangerous," King noted, displaying a text message Katie had sent to her sister alongside a still from the hidden camera taken at the same time. Yet in this message, you claim Sophia was standing over your bed, staring with those dead eyes, while your own security footage shows Sophia sound asleep in her bed at that exact timestamp. How do you explain that discrepancy, Mrs. Gallo? Katie's response, "I must have been confused about the timing," rang hollow in the face of the documentary evidence, and similar exchanges throughout the cross-examination systematically dismantled any remaining credibility in Katie's portrayal of herself as genuinely afraid of Sophia. The most damning moment of Katie's testimony came when King questioned her about the final text exchange with her sister after Sophia's death, in which Katie had written, "It's done. We'll need your help with the story tomorrow." When asked to explain this message if the death had been unplanned, Katie appeared momentarily flustered before responding, "I meant that the situation with Sophia was done, that there had been an accident, and I needed Jenna's help explaining what had happened." King immediately displayed the message that had preceded this exchange. "Made a decision, can't wait for the system to act, will explain later." Sent hours before Sophia's death, asking, "What decision had you made that couldn't wait, Mrs. Gallo?" Katie's visible discomfort and evasive answer, "I don't recall exactly what I meant by that," created what many observers would later describe as the trial's definitive moment, the point at which any possibility of the jury accepting her version of events effectively collapsed. In his closing argument, defense attorney Calloway made a final attempt to salvage some sympathy for his client, acknowledging the tragedy of Sophia's death while arguing that Katie's actions represented an extreme response to genuine psychological distress rather than calculated murder. What happened in the Gallo home was terrible, and nothing can bring Sophia back or undo the harm that was done, Calloway told the jury. But I ask you to consider the distinction between a premeditated act of murder and the actions of a woman who, however misguidedly, had convinced herself she was protecting her family. The law recognizes degrees of culpability, and I urge you to consider whether the evidence truly establishes beyond reasonable doubt the premeditation and malice aforethought required for a first-degree murder conviction. This appeal for a lesser conviction, rather than acquittal, reflected the defense's recognition of the overwhelming evidence against Katie while attempting to avoid the maximum possible sentence. Assistant District Attorney King's closing argument returned to the foundational evidence of the text messages, reinforcing their central role in establishing Katie's premeditation and calculated deception. The defendant would have you believe that these messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death were genuine concerns, but the evidence has established beyond any reasonable doubt that they were part of a methodical campaign to justify what she already planned to do, King told the jury. Every element required for first-degree murder has been proven in this case. Premeditation, as documented in Katie Gallo's own words. Deliberation, as demonstrated by her careful construction of a justification narrative and a cover story, and malice aforethought, as evidenced by the calculated way she isolated, abused, and ultimately killed a vulnerable child in her care. King's closing argument integrated the physical evidence, the digital trail, and the testimony from multiple witnesses into a comprehensive narrative of calculated cruelty, culminating in murder, leaving little room for the reasonable doubt that Calloway had attempted to establish. After receiving instructions from Judge Peterson, the jury retired to begin deliberations at 3:15 on the afternoon of June 13th. Most legal observers expected lengthy deliberations given the complexity of the case and the volume of evidence presented, but the jury would prove these predictions wrong. After just 6 hours and 20 minutes of deliberation, spread across the afternoon of June 13th and the morning of June 14th, the jury notified the court that they had reached a verdict. As word spread that a decision had been reached, the courtroom quickly filled to capacity, with overflow observers directed to an adjacent room where the proceedings would be shown on closed-circuit television. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation as the principals reassembled for the verdict announcement, Katie Gallo appearing noticeably more anxious than she had throughout most of the trial. In a courtroom so quiet that the air conditioning system seemed thunderous by comparison, the jury foreman, a retired high school principal in his 60s, rose to deliver the verdict in response to the clerk's formal inquiry. In the case of State of Alaska versus Katie Gallo on the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. A collective exhalation seemed to move through the courtroom as the verdict was announced, followed by muffled sobs from various observers, including several of Sophia's former teachers and the social worker Michelle Tran. Katie Gallo remained outwardly composed at the announcement, though observers noted her hands gripping the table with such force that her knuckles whitened. Additional verdicts of guilty were announced on the accompanying charges of child abuse, false reporting, and evidence tampering, completing the state's sweep of convictions on all counts. Present via video conference for the verdict was Lucia Martinez, Sophia's biological mother, who had been granted special humanitarian parole to virtually attend key portions of the trial from the American consulate in Guatemala City. The split-screen display showed Lucia's tearful reaction to the verdict, her hand pressed against her mouth as justice was pronounced for her daughter. Through an interpreter, she was permitted to make a brief statement to the court. Sophia was my heart, my only child. I sent her to America to be safe while I fought to return to her. I will never hold her again, but today I know that the woman who took her from me will answer for what she did." This simple, powerful statement from a mother who had lost her child to violence while separated by immigration issues added another layer of poignancy to an already emotionally charged moment, highlighting the multiple systemic failures that had contributed to Sophia's vulnerability. Judge Peterson thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for July 15th, allowing time for the preparation of pre-sentencing reports and victim impact statements. Katie Gallo was remanded to custody without bail to await sentencing, escorted from the courtroom without making any statement or showing visible reaction to her conviction. Outside the courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Natalie King held a brief press conference, expressing satisfaction with the verdict while emphasizing that no legal outcome could truly compensate for the loss of Sophia Martinez. Today's verdict cannot bring Sophia back or heal the wounds her death has caused, but it does establish that our community will not tolerate the abuse and murder of vulnerable children, regardless of the perpetrator's status or the sophistication of their attempts to justify their actions, King stated, flanked by members of the prosecution team and investigators who had worked on the case. The public reaction to the verdict was predominantly one of relief and affirmation that justice had been served, though the case had generated complex reactions within the Fairbanks community and beyond. Local media coverage highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed Sophia's abuse to continue undetected, with editorials calling for reforms to the foster care system and enhanced training for social workers to recognize signs of potential abuse. Support groups for foster and adoptive families issued statements emphasizing that Katie Gallo's actions were a profound aberration rather than representative of foster care, expressing concern that the case might discourage potential foster parents from opening their homes to vulnerable children at a time when the need for safe placements was greater than ever. In the days following the verdict, interviews with jurors revealed that the text messages expressing fear of the girl had been particularly influential in their deliberations, establishing a clear pattern of premeditation that contradicted the defense's portrayal of Katie as overwhelmed or acting in the heat of passion. Those messages weren't just evidence of what she did, but why she did it and how long she had been planning it, one juror told the Fairbanks Daily News Miner on condition of anonymity. When we saw how methodically she had constructed this false narrative about Sophia, and then compared it with the actual evidence of who Sophia really was, there was no question in any of our minds about premeditation or intent. Another juror noted the hidden camera footage was emotionally difficult to watch, but the text messages were actually more disturbing in a way because they showed how deliberately she had built up this justification for what she was planning to do. Legal experts commenting on the case noted its significance in demonstrating the impact of digital evidence in modern criminal prosecutions, with several suggesting that without Katie's text messages and other electronic communications, the case might have been much more difficult to prove beyond reasonable doubt. This case represents a new reality in criminal investigation and prosecution, where perpetrators often create their own most damning evidence through digital communications they mistakenly believe are private or deletable, noted Professor Elaine Harmon of Alaska Pacific University's Criminal Justice Department. The text messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death became the foundation of the prosecution's case, because they provided a window into the defendant's thought process and intentions that would have been nearly impossible to establish so conclusively in the pre-digital era. This analysis underscored how technology had not only facilitated the investigation of Sophia's murder, but had fundamentally shaped the nature of the evidence presented at trial. As the Fairbanks community began the long process of healing from the trauma of Sophia's death and the subsequent trial, The case had already begun to generate changes in how the child welfare system approached foster placements and monitoring. The Alaska Department of Health and Social Services announced a comprehensive review of all active foster placements, with priority given to cases involving children with limited English proficiency or other potential vulnerability factors. Additional training for social workers specifically focused on recognizing signs of isolation and psychological abuse was implemented, with Sophia's case used as a case study in how seemingly minor red flags could indicate more serious underlying issues. These institutional responses, while unable to undo the tragedy that had occurred, represented the beginning of systemic changes that might protect other vulnerable children from suffering Sophia's fate. On July 15th, 6 weeks after the guilty verdict, Katie Gallo returned to the Fairbanks courthouse for sentencing. The intervening period had seen the completion of a pre-sentencing investigation report, the submission of numerous victim impact statements, and growing public discussion about the broader implications of the case for the foster care system. Katie, now noticeably thinner and more subdued than during the trial, entered the courtroom in prison-issued clothing rather than the professional attire she had worn throughout the proceedings. The courtroom was again filled to capacity, with Sophia's teachers, previous foster parents, and community members who had been moved by her story gathered to witness the final phase of the legal process that had consumed Fairbanks for more than 6 months. Judge Marshall Peterson opened the sentencing hearing by acknowledging the extraordinary public interest in the case while emphasizing that his decision would be based solely on the law, the evidence presented at trial, and the relevant factors outlined in Alaska's sentencing guidelines. He invited victim impact statements first, beginning with the video conference connection to Lucia Martinez in Guatemala City. Speaking through an interpreter, Lucia delivered a statement that combined raw grief with remarkable dignity. Sophia was my only child, the light of my life. We were separated not by choice but by circumstance, and I fought every day to reunite with her, never imagining that she would be taken forever while in what should have been a safe place. Lucia described her daily ritual of lighting a candle beside Sophia's photograph, her ongoing nightmares about her daughter's final moments, and her struggle to find meaning in a world without the child who had been her primary motivation. The woman who killed my daughter took not only Sophia's life but my future, my hope, my reason for continuing. Justice requires that she understand the magnitude of what she has stolen from this world. Additional impact statements came from Sophia's previous foster mother, who had maintained contact with Sophia until Katie restricted their communication. Sophia's court-appointed special advocate, who expressed profound regret at having failed to recognize the warning signs of abuse. And Mrs. Cardwell, Sophia's teacher, who spoke movingly about the empty desk in her classroom that had remained unoccupied for the remainder of the school year as a silent memorial to a bright, kind child whose potential would never be realized. Perhaps the most unexpected impact statement came from James Gallo, Katie's husband, who had filed for divorce following her conviction and appeared at sentencing to express his own sense of guilt and betrayal. I failed Sophia by not being present enough to see what was happening in my own home, by trusting blindly when I should have questioned, by not recognizing the changes in my wife's behavior that might have allowed me to intervene before it was too late. While I cannot bear the same legal responsibility as Katie, I will carry the moral weight of Sophia's death for the rest of my life. Before pronouncing sentence, Judge Peterson offered Katie the opportunity to address the court, a moment many observers had anticipated as potentially revealing of whether her time in custody had led to genuine insight or remorse. Katie rose slowly, unfolding a single sheet of paper, but ultimately setting it aside to speak extemporaneously. I understand that nothing I say can bring Sophia back or reduce the pain I've caused. she began, her voice initially steady. "I accept responsibility for her death and for failing in my duty to protect a child placed in my care." This acknowledgment, more direct than anything she had said during trial, gave way to a statement that still revealed her fundamental inability to fully comprehend the nature of her actions. "I became convinced that Sophia was a threat, that she couldn't attach properly, that she might hurt my biological children. I now understand that I was projecting my own inadequacies onto her, seeing threats that weren't there because I couldn't accept my failure as a foster parent." Katie's statement continued with a quality that many observers would later describe as performative remorse rather than genuine contrition, focusing primarily on her own psychological journey and the consequences she faced rather than the suffering she had inflicted on Sophia. "I've lost everything, my freedom, my family, my reputation, my future. Nothing will ever be the same after what happened." Only toward the end of her statement did Katie directly address Sophia's mother. "To Ms. Martinez, I can only say that I am sorry for taking your daughter from you. She deserved better than what I gave her." The apology, while explicit, struck many as too little and too late, particularly given the extensive evidence presented at trial of Katie's methodical campaign against Sophia and her continued attempts during the trial to justify her actions as misguided protection rather than calculated cruelty. As Katie concluded and returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent, her words having done little to diminish the collective grief and anger that permeated the proceedings. Judge Peterson delivered his sentencing decision with the measured tone that had characterized his handling of the entire trial, but with an undercurrent of moral clarity that left no doubt about his view of the case's severity. "The murder of a child represents a unique category of offense, one that strikes at the very foundation of our social contract," Peterson began. "When that child is not only young and vulnerable, but specifically entrusted to the perpetrator's care through our foster system, the violation extends beyond the individual victim to undermine essential structures of protection and trust upon which our community depends." Peterson methodically reviewed the aggravating factors in the case, the vulnerability of the victim, the violation of a position of trust, the extended period of abuse preceding the murder, and the elaborate efforts to conceal the crime and deflect responsibility before announcing his decision. Katie Gallo was sentenced to 99 years imprisonment for the first-degree murder of Sophia Martinez, with additional consecutive sentences for the child abuse, false reporting, and evidence tampering charges, effectively ensuring she would remain incarcerated for the remainder of her life. In explaining his decision to impose the maximum sentence allowable under Alaska law, Judge Peterson specifically referenced the text messages that had formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. The communications documenting the defendant's progressive construction of a false narrative about Sophia, particularly the messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death, provide unassailable evidence not only of premeditation, but of a calculated campaign to dehumanize a vulnerable child in order to justify escalating abuse and ultimately murder. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment or an action taken in the heat of passion, but a methodical process of isolation, psychological torture, and ultimately the deliberate taking of an innocent life. This judicial assessment, delivered with the full authority of the court, provided a final definitive interpretation of the text messages that had initially triggered the investigation and ultimately secured Katie Gallo's conviction. The sentencing of Katie Gallo marked the conclusion of the legal process, but the repercussions of Sophia Martinez's murder continued to reverberate throughout the child welfare system in Alaska and beyond. In August, 2 months after the verdict, the Alaska Department of Health and Social Services released a comprehensive review of the case that identified multiple points at which different decisions or more rigorous oversight might have prevented the tragedy. The report highlighted systemic issues, including excessive caseloads for social workers that limited their ability to conduct thorough, unannounced home visits, insufficient integration of information between schools, medical providers, and social services that allowed warning signs to go unrecognized, and inadequate training in recognizing signs of psychological abuse and isolation that might not leave physical evidence but could indicate escalating risk to a child's safety. The most significant policy change to emerge directly from Sofia's case was the establishment of the Sophia Martinez Protocol for Foster Care Oversight in Alaska, formally implemented in January of the following year on the anniversary of Sophia's death. This comprehensive set of guidelines mandated more frequent unannounced home visits for newly placed foster children, required separate private interviews with foster children conducted by social workers specifically trained in trauma-informed questioning techniques, established enhanced background checks for potential foster parents, including review of social media activity and digital communications, and created a multi-agency review team for any reports of concern about a foster placement, ensuring that information from schools, medical providers, previous foster families, and other sources would be integrated rather than evaluated in isolation. While these changes came too late for Sophia, they represented a meaningful legacy that might protect other vulnerable children from similar fates. The case also generated significant national attention, becoming a focal point for discussions about immigration policy, family separation, and the foster care system. Investigative journalists traced Sophia's journey from Guatemala to San Diego to Fairbanks, highlighting how the separation from her mother through immigration enforcement had created the vulnerability that ultimately led to her placement in Katie Gallo's home. Advocacy organizations on both sides of the immigration debate cited Sophia's story, some arguing that family separation policies had created the conditions for her death, others contending that better vetting and monitoring of foster placements was the more relevant issue. This political dimension added another layer of complexity to a case that had already generated profound questions about institutional responsibility, individual psychology, and the protection of vulnerable children. Lucia Martinez, Sophia's mother, faced the additional trauma of navigating these political currents while mourning her daughter and attempting to secure permission to visit Sophia's gravesite in Fairbanks. Her quest to obtain a humanitarian visa for this purpose became a minor cause célèbre, with congressional representatives, religious leaders, and community organizations advocating on her behalf. 6 months after Katie's sentencing, Lucia was granted a 30-day humanitarian parole to travel to Alaska, where she was finally able to visit the small grave marker bearing her daughter's name, birth date, and the simple inscription, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." Photographs of Lucia kneeling beside Sophia's grave, placing a handmade Guatemalan doll and flowers on the snow-covered ground, were published worldwide, putting a human face on the often abstract debates about immigration policy and family separation. During her time in Fairbanks, Lucia also met with many of the people who had been part of Sophia's life, her teachers, classmates, previous foster parents, and even Detective Ryan Palmer and Ada Natalie King, who had worked to bring Katie Gallo to justice. These connections provided Lucia with a more complete picture of her daughter's final year of life, including the positive experiences and relationships Sophia had formed despite the difficulties she faced. Mrs. Cardwell shared Sophia's schoolwork and art projects. Classmates described her kindness and sense of humor, and Sophia's first foster family in Fairbanks showed Lucia photos of happy moments before Sophia's transfer to the Gallo home. While these glimpses of Sophia's life could not diminish the tragedy of her death, they offered Lucia some comfort in knowing that her daughter had experienced love and connection even during their separation. The professional consequences for those who had failed to protect Sophia were significant, though less public than the criminal proceedings against Katie Gallo. Michelle Tran, Sophia's social worker, resigned from the Department of Health and Social Services following the trial, later speaking openly in training sessions for social work students about the case and the lessons she had learned from it. I was following protocols and checking boxes, Tran acknowledged in one such session, but I wasn't seeing Sophia, really seeing her, or picking up on the signs that something was deeply wrong in that placement. My caseload of 34 families was not an excuse, but a symptom of a system that prioritized processing over protection. This honest reckoning with professional failure became an important component of the reforms implemented after Sophia's death, emphasizing the human dimensions of child welfare work beyond procedural compliance. Katie's sister, Jenna Gallo Briggs, served 8 months in prison for her role as an accessory after the fact, a relatively light sentence reflecting both her plea agreement and the prosecution's assessment that she had been manipulated by her sister rather than being an active participant in the abuse or murder of Sophia. Upon her release, Jenna relocated to Oregon, where she began speaking to psychology students and law enforcement groups about the dynamics of coercive relationships and the gradual process by which she had been drawn into her sister's distorted reality. Her willingness to examine her own moral and psychological failure became a valuable case study for professionals working to understand how otherwise ordinary people can become complicit in extraordinary evil through incremental compromises and psychological manipulation. 2 years after Sophia's death, on what would have been her 10th birthday, the Fairbanks School District dedicated a new playground at Jackson Elementary School in her memory. The Sophia Martinez Memorial Playground featured equipment accessible to children of all abilities, a small garden with butterfly-attracting plants, and a mosaic wall created by Sophia's former classmates, incorporating elements from her artwork and favorite colors. At the dedication ceremony, attended by hundreds of community members, including Lucia Martinez, who had been granted another humanitarian visa for the occasion, Sophia's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Cardwell, spoke about the significance of creating a space of joy and play to honor a child whose life had been cut short by violence. Sophia found happiness where she could, even in difficult circumstances. This playground represents our community's commitment to ensuring that all children have safe spaces to play, grow, and be fully seen and protected. The most profound legacy of Sophia's case emerged in the form of institutional change within the foster care and child welfare systems, not only in Alaska, but increasingly across the nation, as other states examined their own procedures in light of the failures exposed by Sophia's death. The digital monitoring aspect of the Sophia Martinez Protocol, which established guidelines for reviewing concerning patterns in foster parents' electronic communications, became a model for similar programs in 12 other states within 3 years of its implementation in Alaska. While raising complex questions about privacy and surveillance, these programs reflected a growing recognition that potential warning signs often exist in digital spaces long before they manifest in physical abuse, and that properly trained professionals reviewing such communications with appropriate oversight could potentially identify high-risk situations before they escalate to tragedy. Katie Gallo herself became a subject of psychological study, with her case featured in textbooks and training materials on narcissistic personality disorder, attachment disturbances, and the psychology of child abuse. The extensive documentation of her progressive dehumanization of Sophia through text messages, journal entries, and staged photography provided unprecedented insight into the thought processes that can lead to violence against children. Dr. Eleanor Winters, the forensic psychologist who had testified at trial, published a detailed analysis of the case in the Journal of Forensic Psychology, identifying Katie's text messages expressing fear of Sophia as a critical window into the projection and rationalization mechanisms that had allowed her to view her own increasing abusive impulses as justified responses to a manufactured threat. This academic examination of the case ensured that the lessons learned from Sophia's tragedy would inform professional practice and potentially prevent similar cases in the future. 10 years after Sophia's death, a documentary filmmaker produced Messages of Fear, a feature-length examination of the case that placed Sophia's story in the broader context of child welfare policy, immigration issues, and psychological dynamics of abuse. The film, which won awards at several festivals and was eventually broadcast nationally, was careful to center Sophia's humanity rather than sensationalizing the details of her death, including interviews with her teachers, classmates, now college students, and her mother Lucia, who had by then been granted permanent residency in the United States through a humanitarian visa program expanded partially in response to advocacy around her case. The documentary concluded with footage of the Sophia Martinez Memorial Playground, filled with laughing children, a bittersweet reminder of the joy that Sophia herself had been denied, but that her legacy had helped to protect for others. The case of Sophia Martinez and Katie Gallo became, in many ways, a watershed moment in the evolution of child protection systems in the 21st century, highlighting both the persistent vulnerabilities of children separated from their families and the new forms of evidence that might help protect them. The text messages expressing fear of the girl days before her death, messages that had initially seemed to support Katie's claims of concern, but ultimately exposed her premeditation, became a canonical example in training programs for law enforcement, social workers, and prosecutors of how digital evidence could reveal the truth behind carefully constructed facades. Sophia's story, tragic as it was, ultimately contributed to a more vigilant, integrated approach to child protection that recognized the sophisticated ways in which abusers might attempt to justify or conceal their actions, particularly in the digital age. In the frozen landscape of Fairbanks, where the endless winter nights had once hidden Katie Gallo's escalating abuse of Sophia, Martinez, the systems designed to protect vulnerable children, underwent a transformation that would never fully compensate for what had been lost, but might ensure that such failures would not be repeated. Sophia's short life ended by calculated cruelty that had disguised itself as concern, left behind not only grief, but a legacy of reform that would protect countless children whose names would never make headlines because they would be spared her fate. As Lucia Martinez said at the 10th anniversary memorial service held at her daughter's playground, Sophia's life mattered. Through her, many children now live in safety who might otherwise have been lost. My daughter has become a light in the darkness for others, and in that way, she lives on.